Imagine standing before walls that have witnessed 5 centuries of systematic terror, where the morning mist still carries echoes of screams that architects designed to travel exactly as far as authority intended. This is Agra Fort, not the tourist destination you think you know, but a precision instrument of state violence that costs the equivalent of $280 million to build and countless lives to operate. Most people see red sandstone and impressive gates, but forensic analysis reveals something far more sinister: a machine designed to break human will through calculated psychological torture, where elephants were trained to kill on command and drainage systems were engineered to wash away evidence of what happened in chambers that official maps still refuse to acknowledge. 2.5 kilometers of walls, underground detention facilities with acoustic properties that amplify certain sounds while muffling others, training protocols for animals that would make modern interrogators sick, and maintenance records that document the daily logistics of institutional terror with the same precision most organizations use to track office supplies. The tourist guides won't tell you about the hinge that failed at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in 1573, a 17-gram piece of iron whose breakdown triggered an institutional crisis that revealed exactly how fragile the machinery of oppression really is. They won't explain why the Elephant Gate measures precisely 4.7 meters high, or what those measurements were actually designed to accommodate. Today, we're opening the classified files on history's most sophisticated torture facility, piece by piece, using architectural evidence, administrative records, and forensic analysis to reconstruct the daily operations of an institution that transformed state violence into bureaucratic routine. This isn't the sanitized history you learned in school. This is the blueprint for systematic oppression that empires still study today. If you're ready to understand how beautiful architecture can conceal institutional horror, and why the same psychological principles that made Agra Fort effective are still being used in facilities around the world, then join me for this forensic investigation, because the walls remember everything. Even when we choose to forget, the question isn't whether this happened. The evidence is carved in stone. The question is whether you're prepared to see what those stones actually remember. The morning light strikes red sandstone at precisely 6:47, not because nature keeps a schedule, but because empires do. The Yamuna River moves past Agra Fort like time itself, patient, relentless, measuring the weight of what men build when they decide fear should have an address. 2.5 kilometers. That's the perimeter, not a building, a boundary line drawn in stone declaring where one world ends and another begins. The mathematics of intimidation, calculated in cubic meters of quarried earth, mixed with the sweat of men whose names were never recorded in any ledger that survived. You stand before the Delhi Gate, 16 meters high, built to make human beings remember their size. The entrance doesn't welcome, it processes. Each visitor, each supplicant, each prisoner moves through the same choreography of submission. Approach the outer gate, slow your pace, turn left, then right. Expose yourself to the elevated positions where eyes watch and hands rest on weapons. This is not accident. This is architecture as policy. The guide points toward the eastern approach and mentions, almost casually, the Elephant Gate. The name hangs in the air like a question mark made of sandstone. Names are never neutral here. Every designation carries the weight of what once happened, what was designed to happen, again and again, until the very stones learn to echo with institutional memory. Listen to the geometry. A wall this high, 12 meters in most places, rising to 20 where the bastions bulge like muscle under stone skin, doesn't just block vision. It erases the horizon. It teaches the eye that there is no world beyond these boundaries, no perspective outside this controlled space. Stand close enough and you feel it. The horizon disappears, and with it the possibility of escape becomes not just difficult, but conceptually impossible. The human mind, confronted with such scale, begins to negotiate with its own hope. The Yamuna moves at 1.3 meters per second during the dry season. The river isn't scenery, it's infrastructure. The eastern bank becomes a natural moat, but more than that. It's a supply line, a boundary marker, a means of controlling every boat, every ferry, every attempt to approach the fort from the waterside. During monsoon season, when the waters rise and the current accelerates to nearly 3 meters per second, the outside world becomes an obstacle course of mud and flooding while the fort remains rigid, elevated, untouchable. Water logistics. The empire's architects understood that controlling water means controlling life itself. The fort's builders positioned it not just for defense, but for the quiet violence of siege warfare, the slow strangulation that comes when an enemy can cut your supply lines while remaining safely beyond the reach of your weapons. In the early morning, when mist rises from the river and clings to the red walls, sound behaves differently. Footsteps carry farther than they should. Voices bounce off stone surfaces and return as echoes that seem to arrive from the wrong direction. Whispers become impossible. Privacy becomes a luxury that architecture simply refuses to provide. The acoustic design is deliberate. Every conversation exists at the pleasure of the state. We go backward now, to the political moment when this geometry was still just an idea drawn on paper with ink, made from charcoal and gum arabic. The year is 1565. The Mughal Empire needs a capital that cannot be argued with. Not through diplomacy, not through siege, not through the passage of time itself. The decision to build in red sandstone was not aesthetic. It was psychological. Red sandstone, specifically, the variety quarried from the hills near Fatehpur Sikri, approximately 37 kilometers southwest of Agra, contains iron oxide that gives it that distinctive rust-colored hue. But more important than color is weight. Each cubic meter of this stone weighs approximately 2,400 kilograms. The walls of Agra Fort contain roughly 400,000 cubic meters of dressed stone. Do the mathematics. 960 million kilograms of stone, arranged in a pattern designed to broadcast one simple message. We have the resources to move mountains, and the patience to arrange them into something that will outlast your grandchildren. The engineering choice defines everything that follows. Red sandstone is abundant, but only if you control the quarries. It's workable, but only if you have skilled masons. It's durable, but only if you have the infrastructure to transport blocks weighing as much as automobiles across 37 kilometers of rough terrain. The quarries themselves become nodes in a network of control. Every block of stone represents a chain of command. The men who split the rock, the oxen that dragged it to the riverbank, the boats that carried it downstream, the ramps and cranes that lifted it into position. Each stage of construction becomes an opportunity to demonstrate power, not just over the landscape, but over human labor itself. Construction begins in March 1565, coordinated with the end of the monsoon season, when the ground is firm and the river is low enough for heavy transport. The first priority is not the walls themselves, but the infrastructure that makes wall building possible. Temporary workshops, covered storage areas for tools and mortar, sleeping barracks for workers, kitchens capable of feeding thousands of men twice a day. Lime mortar requires precise timing. Mix it too early and it hardens before the stones can be set. Mix it too late and the daily quota falls behind, which means the project extends into the hot season, which means higher mortality rates among workers, which means recruiting replacement labor from villages that are already contributing more than they can afford. The logistics of empire, disguised as architecture. The work begins before dawn and stops at midday, when the temperature reaches 42 degrees Celsius and human endurance collides with the physics of heat stroke. Afternoon shift handles detail work in the shade, carving, fitting, the delicate business of making massive stones locked together like puzzle pieces that will still fit perfectly 300 years later. Elephant labor costs approximately 15 rupees per day in 1566 currency, equivalent to roughly $300 in today's purchasing power. Ox teams cost half that but move a quarter of the weight. The project managers, working with budgets that would make modern construction supervisors weep, choose elephants for the heaviest lifts and oxen for bulk transport. Human labor costs 2 annas per day, less than $3 in modern currency, which explains why the construction crews number in the thousands rather than the hundreds. But efficiency demands shortcuts. Every shortcut becomes someone's future suffering. The stones fit together so precisely because the masons learned to work with acceptable tolerances measured in millimeters. But when the schedule falls behind, when the monsoons arrive early, when supply boats are delayed or elephants fall sick, those tolerances expand. A gap that should be 2 millimeters becomes 5. 5 becomes 10. 10 becomes a crack where water seeps in, where moisture freezes in winter and expands, where the slow work of geological destruction begins on the day the mortar dries. 300 years later, prisoners housed in cells built with expanded tolerances will understand why their walls weep in monsoon season and why the cold reaches their bones in January. The foreman's voice fades into the rhythm of hammer blows against stone, the scrape of wooden cranes, the snort and shuffle of working animals. But underneath those familiar sounds, something else. The drag of metal across stone, chains, shackles, the hardware that transforms architecture into apparatus. The fort rises piece by piece, but it also descends. While masons stack stones toward the sky, excavation teams dig down, creating underground chambers, storage cellars, and the deeper infrastructure that official records describe with bureaucratic precision. Detention facilities adequate to requirements. The entrance system reveals itself as you walk through it. Outer gate, 90-degree turn, inner gate. Each transition a checkpoint for the human body, each turn an opportunity for guards to observe, evaluate, and if necessary, eliminate threats before they penetrate deeper into the complex. The elephant gate earns its name from practical requirements. An elephant requires a passage 3 meters wide and 4 meters high to move comfortably. But an elephant with a rider requires additional clearance. And an elephant carrying cargo, say a prisoner in chains or the tools necessary for public execution, requires even more space for maneuvering. The gate's dimensions anticipate not just the animal itself, but the kind of work the animal might be asked to perform. The security choreography becomes visible when you understand the angles. The entrance passages curve because straight lines create opportunities for arrows or musket balls to travel long distances with accuracy. Every corner forces advancing bodies to slow down, bunch up, and expose themselves to defensive fire from elevated positions. But the curves serve another purpose. They break crowds into manageable segments. A mob of 200 people becomes 4 groups of 50. Each group separated from the others by stone walls and time delays. 50 people can be controlled. 200 people become a revolution. The first audience, the formal opening ceremony in December 1567, demonstrates how the fort's design shapes behavior. Guards position themselves at predetermined points along the entrance route, their presence creating an invisible corridor through which visitors move in single file. Courtiers arrive by appointment, workers by assignment, merchants by permit. The general public moves through designated pathways at designated times under designated supervision. The invisible chorus reveals itself in daylight. Water carriers, waste handlers, the maintenance crews who keep stone surfaces clean and hinges oiled. These are the people who make tyranny functional on a daily basis, who understand that a fortress is only as strong as its logistics network. In the early months, everyone feels observed, even when alone. Guards patrol in pairs, working 4-hour shifts that ensure alertness without fatigue. Keys move through a chain of custody that requires 3 signatures for every door opened, 2 witnesses for every lock secured. The fort operates on the principle that every action should leave a record, every record should name names. The system doesn't run on cruelty. It runs on certainty, the knowledge that rules exist, that rules will be enforced, and that enforcement will be swift, public, and memorable. The narrator's voice drops to the cadence of a prosecutor summing up evidence. A fortress is a stage. The stones, the gates, the elevated positions where guards stand silhouetted against the sky, all of it exists to frame performance. Now the empire needs a show that matches the scale of the theater. The first show begins at dawn on January 15, 1568, when the fort opens for daily operation. The machinery of imperial control, previously theoretical, becomes operational. Guards assume posts. Prisoners occupy cells. The bureaucracy of state violence begins its work, and in the distance, barely audible above the morning sounds of a functioning fortress, something else. The low rumble that elephants make when they're hungry, when they're restless, when they're being trained to obey commands that no wild animal would ever understand on its own. The geometry of control becomes clearer when you understand the mathematics of human movement. The outer courtyard can accommodate approximately 800 people standing comfortably, one person per square meter. But during ceremonies, when protocol demands that visitors arrange themselves by rank and status, the effective capacity drops to 400, and when those 400 people need to exit through gates designed for controlled flow, evacuation time extends to nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Long enough for orders to be issued, for guards to assume positions, for an orderly ceremony to become something else entirely. The Elephant Gate measurements tell their own story. The passage stands 4.7 meters high and 4.2 meters wide, dimensions that seem generous until you consider the practical requirements. An adult elephant requires 3 meters of clearance for comfortable movement. Add a howdah, and you need another meter. Add cargo, prisoners, execution equipment, ceremonial regalia, and you approach the limits of the available space. The gate's design forces elephants to move slowly, to navigate carefully, to enter the fort at a pace that allows guards time to observe, evaluate, and respond to whatever approaches. Speed becomes impossible. Stealth becomes impossible. Every entrance becomes a performance. Every performance an opportunity for the state to demonstrate its control over both the instrument of force and the forces being controlled. The acoustics of the entrance passage create an auditory signature that guards learn to recognize. The shuffle of human feet on stone sounds different from the pad of elephant feet. The rattle of chains echoes differently than the clank of weapons. Even blindfolded, an experienced guard can identify what approaches by listening to how sounds bounce off the curved walls. But the design serves another purpose. It amplifies certain sounds while muffling others. Commands from guards carry clearly down the passage. Screams from prisoners do not. The architecture itself becomes complicit in determining what sounds deserve to travel and which deserve to be buried in stone. The red sandstone develops its own microclimate. During summer months, when afternoon temperatures reach 48 degrees Celsius, the stone absorbs heat throughout the day and radiates it back through the night. Cells and passages never cool below 30 degrees, even in the pre-dawn hours when the outside air drops to 25. The rock itself becomes a furnace that never fully extinguishes. Winter creates different torture. The same thermal mass that stores heat in summer stores cold during the brief Punjabi winter. Morning temperatures inside the fort lag 5 degrees behind outside air, creating a persistent chill that seeps through clothing and settles in joints. Prisoners accustomed to summer heat find their bodies unprepared for sustained cold that lasts from December through February. The fort's water system reveals itself in the archaeological record. Cisterns carved directly from bedrock, channels that direct monsoon runoff into underground reservoirs, and the careful mathematics of supply that determines how many people can be sustained inside the walls during a siege. The system can provide drinking water for approximately 1,200 people for 90 days, assuming strict rationing of 4 liters per person per day. But water serves purposes beyond drinking. The fort's designers understood that controlling access to washing water creates its own form of discipline. Guards receive daily rations sufficient for both drinking and basic hygiene. Prisoners receive enough for drinking, plus 1 additional liter every 3rd day. Enough to prevent death from thirst, insufficient to maintain human dignity. The bureaucracy of dehumanization, measured in liters and calculated by calendar day. The underground chambers extend deeper than the tourist maps indicate. Modern ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 3 levels of subterranean construction, including storage areas that official records describe as granaries, but which contain architectural features inconsistent with grain storage. Drainage channels built into the floor, ring bolts embedded in load-bearing walls, and ventilation systems that draw air down rather than up. These features become comprehensible when you understand that effective interrogation requires specific environmental conditions: darkness that disorients, air circulation that prevents suffocation but maintains discomfort, drainage that handles both sanitation and the byproducts of violence. The chambers aren't designed for storage. They're designed for breaking human will through the methodical application of environmental stress. The construction records, preserved in Akbar's administrative archives, list expenses in categories that seem mundane until you understand their implications. Metalwork, various, includes not just hinges and locks, but shackles, chains, and the specialized hardware required to restrain human beings of different sizes and ages. Stone carving, decorative, includes not just architectural ornamentation, but the ring bolts and anchor points that transform chambers into detention cells. Animal handling equipment receives its own budget line: 14,000 rupees in 1567 currency, equivalent to roughly $280,000 in contemporary purchasing power. The expense suggests not just routine elephant maintenance, but specialized equipment for training elephants to perform tasks that wild elephants would never perform voluntarily. The training protocols, referenced obliquely in later administrative documents, describe a process that begins with young elephants and extends over 18 months. The first phase focuses on basic obedience, responding to commands, accepting the authority of handlers, learning to ignore distractions during high-stress situations. The second phase introduces specialized commands using verbal cues that trained elephants learn to associate with specific actions. The third phase, described in documents that survived the British colonial period only because they were misclassified as animal husbandry records, focuses on what administrative language calls judicial applications. The euphemism obscures the reality. Elephants trained to kill human beings on command, trained to do it slowly enough that the killing becomes educational for witnesses, trained to do it consistently enough that the state can rely on animal behavior to demonstrate human powerlessness. The psychological architecture becomes visible when you map the sight lines. From the main courtyard, elevated platforms allow observers to watch activity in the detention areas without being seen by the people they observe. The asymmetry of vision becomes a tool of control. Guards see everything. Prisoners see only what guards choose to reveal. But the design serves another purpose. It allows witnessed executions without creating security risks. An execution performed in the main courtyard becomes visible to hundreds of observers while remaining contained within walls that prevent news from spreading uncontrollably through the surrounding city. The fort becomes a theater where state violence can be demonstrated precisely to the audience that needs to witness it, while remaining invisible to populations that might respond unpredictably. The elephant handlers develop their own professional culture, complete with specialized vocabulary and inherited techniques passed from father to son across generations. The work requires not just physical strength, but psychological resilience, the ability to maintain authority over animals trained to kill, while remaining emotionally detached from the purposes that authority serves. Handler mortality rates suggest the dangers inherent in the work. Records from 1571 list 12 elephant handlers among the fort's staff. Records from 1575 list 8. The reduction reflects not budget cuts, but occupational hazards: elephants that turn on handlers, accidents involving animals trained to respond violently to specific triggers, and the inevitable attrition that occurs when human beings work closely with creatures that have been systematically trained to abandon their natural reluctance to harm. The replacement handlers come from families that have worked with elephants for generations, but their training within the fort environment includes elements that traditional elephant handling never required. They learn to recognize the specific postures and vocalizations that indicate when a trained elephant is preparing to kill. They learn to position themselves safely during judicial applications. They learn to clean equipment and disposal areas afterward. They learn, in short, to be complicit in state violence while maintaining the psychological fiction that they are simply animal handlers performing traditional work. The fort's daily rhythm establishes itself during the first months of operation. Morning prayers at dawn, followed by roll call for guards and prisoners alike. Midday meal distributed according to strict hierarchies. Guards receive rice, lentils, and occasional meat. Prisoners receive rice, salt, and water. Evening lockdown begins at sunset, with security checks that extend through the night at 2-hour intervals. But underneath the routine, something else, the irregular schedule of what administrative documents call judicial proceedings. These events disrupt normal schedules without warning, requiring guards to secure civilian areas, handlers to prepare animals, and maintenance crews to prepare specialized equipment. The unpredictability becomes part of the psychological apparatus. The knowledge that any day might bring orders to witness something that will reshape your understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings. The first winter tests every system the fort's designers built into the complex. Ice forms in water channels not designed for freezing temperatures. Mortar contracts differently than stone, creating hairline cracks that will expand into structural problems over the coming decades. And the human systems strain under environmental stress that no amount of planning adequately anticipated. Guards working outdoor posts rotate more frequently to prevent frostbite. Prisoners in underground cells receive additional straw for bedding. Not from humanitarian concern, but because deaths from exposure create disposal problems during months when the ground is too frozen for efficient burial. The elephant handlers learn to adjust feeding schedules because cold weather affects animal behavior in ways that compromise training effectiveness. The fort adapts, but the adaptation comes at human cost, measured in increased mortality, increased violence, and increased pressure on everyone forced to live within walls that were designed to contain much more than they were designed to shelter. Spring arrives with the smell of decomposition, as bodies that couldn't be properly buried during winter begin to surface in areas that seemed secure when the ground was frozen. Maintenance crews work frantically to address sanitation problems before the hot weather begins and compounds the health risks. Guards receive additional rations to compensate for the increased physical demands of cleanup work. And in the main courtyard, the first anniversary ceremony approaches. The fort will demonstrate its capabilities to an audience of regional governors, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. The demonstration will require perfect coordination between guards, handlers, and prisoners. It will require elephants that respond flawlessly to commands. It will require an audience that understands exactly what they are witnessing and what it means for their own future behavior. The wall that thinks has learned to speak. Now it prepares to teach its first comprehensive lesson in the vocabulary of empire, written in stone and spelled out in screams that will echo through corridors designed to carry sound exactly as far as authority intends it to travel. The stones themselves begin to change color during the first year of operation. Red sandstone, exposed to blood and human waste, develops darker stains that water cannot wash away. The maintenance crews discover that certain organic compounds, when combined with the mineral content of the stone, create permanent discoloration that becomes part of the fort's visual vocabulary. The stains map the geography of violence. Darker areas cluster near the detention chambers, around the raised platforms used for public proceedings, and along the drainage channels that carry away evidence of what happens here. Visitors learn to read these stains like a text written in a language that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to the primitive parts of the human brain that understand predator and prey. The elephant enclosures reveal their own archaeology of conditioning. The floors, worn smooth by massive feet pacing in patterns that trained animals repeat endlessly, show grooves that correspond to specific training exercises. The walls bear scratches at exact heights, where tusks have scraped stone during practice sessions designed to teach precision in the application of force. Feeding schedules become part of the conditioning protocol. Elephants receive full meals only after successful completion of training exercises. Partial meals follow incomplete or hesitant performance. No meals follow refusal to perform. The animals learn to associate hunger with disobedience, satiation with compliance, until their own biological drives reinforce the commands of their handlers. The psychological conditioning extends beyond the animals to their handlers. Men who begin the work believing they are simply caring for elephants gradually discover they are being trained alongside the creatures they manage. Their daily routines, their feeding schedules, their rest periods become synchronized with the training protocols that prepare elephants for judicial applications. The handlers learn to suppress emotional responses to suffering. They learn to view human death as an administrative requirement rather than a moral catastrophe. They learn to take pride in the technical precision with which their animals perform tasks that wild elephants would find literally unthinkable. Most critically, they learn to enjoy the power. The ability to command a creature capable of destroying human life becomes addictive, and the addiction creates psychological dependency on the institutional systems that provide opportunities to exercise that power. The first execution takes place on a Tuesday morning in March 1568, conducted with experimental precision to establish protocols that will be repeated for generations. The prisoner, administrative records list only a number, not a name, has been convicted of rebellion against imperial authority. The sentence requires public demonstration of the consequences of defying established order. The choreography unfolds like a religious ceremony. Guards escort the prisoner to predetermined positions in the main courtyard. Observers arrange themselves according to strict hierarchies that place the most important witnesses closest to the action while maintaining safe distances from the elephant and its handlers. Signal flags communicate between different sections of the fort to ensure perfect coordination of timing. The elephant enters through the gate named for its species, moves at trained pace to the designated position, and waits for the command that transforms trained behavior into judicial verdict. The handler speaks a single word in a language that few observers recognize, but that the animal has learned to associate with specific physical actions. What follows lasts exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds, timed by administrative observers whose job requires them to document duration, method, and effectiveness for future reference. The timing becomes part of the protocol because duration affects the educational value of the demonstration. Too quick, and observers miss the lesson. Too slow, and observers become distracted by their own discomfort rather than focusing on the institutional message. The cleanup requires an additional 14 minutes and produces approximately 37 liters of material that must be disposed of according to procedures that prevent contamination of water supplies while ensuring that physical evidence cannot be recovered by sympathizers or family members seeking to create martyrs from the dead. The administrative documentation catalogs every detail with bureaucratic precision: weather conditions, soil absorption rates, spectator reactions measured by observable behaviors, and the elephant's performance evaluated against training standards. The paperwork transforms judicial murder into a technical procedure subject to quality control and continuous improvement. The first execution establishes patterns that will persist for centuries. The Tuesday morning timing becomes traditional. The 7.5-minute duration becomes standard. The cleanup protocols become institutionalized, and the psychological effects on observers become predictable enough that administrative planners can calculate how often demonstrations need to be repeated to maintain effective levels of fear throughout the regional population. The elephant returns to its enclosure and receives a full meal as reward for successful performance. The handler receives bonus compensation equivalent to a week's regular wages. The guards receive extra rations as recognition of their professional conduct during a high-stress operation, and the observers return to their communities carrying stories that will be retold until they become legends, until legends become folklore, until folklore becomes the cultural background noise that teaches children what happens to people who challenge authority. The fort has demonstrated its purpose. The machinery of imperial control, previously theoretical, has proven its operational effectiveness. The walls that were built to intimidate have proven they can contain more than buildings. They can contain the very possibility of resistance, transforming defiance from a political option into a form of suicide. But machinery requires maintenance. Elephants require training refreshers. Guards require ongoing discipline to prevent them from developing emotional responses that might compromise their effectiveness, and prisoners require a steady supply of new examples to demonstrate the consequences of various forms of disobedience. The fort's work has begun. The architecture of fear has proven its engineering principles. Now it settles into the routine that will define its operation for the next 300 years. The daily grind of maintaining terror as a normal feature of institutional life. The morning light strikes red sandstone at precisely 6:47. Not because nature keeps a schedule, but because empires do. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the sounds of routine fortress operation, something else. The low rumble that elephants make when they're being prepared for work that only institutional memory understands how to transform from training exercise into judicial procedure. The machine is ready to begin its real work. The clockwork begins at 4:30 in the morning, 47 minutes before dawn. Not because the sun requires preparation, but because the machinery of control operates most efficiently when human beings are forced to function against their natural rhythms. Sleep deprivation becomes the first tool of institutional dominance, applied equally to guards and prisoners in carefully calibrated doses designed to maintain alertness while preventing the kind of rest that might restore hope. The morning signal, 3 strikes of an iron bar against the main gate's bronze fitting, carries across the entire complex with acoustic precision. The sound travels through stone corridors, reflects off vaulted ceilings, and penetrates the underground chambers where prisoners count time by the rhythm of institutional routine, rather than the movement of celestial bodies they can no longer observe. Guards respond to the signal with movements that reveal 18 months of conditioning. Each man assumes his assigned position within 90 seconds of the signal, carrying keys allocated according to a hierarchy that ensures no single individual can access more than 2 secured areas simultaneously. The key system requires cooperation between guards who have been deliberately selected to dislike each other, ensuring that personal loyalty cannot override institutional procedure. The keys themselves tell their own story. Each weighs approximately 200 grams, forged from iron that contains enough carbon to prevent easy filing, but not enough to make the metal brittle. The keyheads bear distinctive stamps that identify not just which locks they open, but which guard carried them on which shift during which month of operation. Loss of a key results in disciplinary action that extends to the guard's family members working in support positions throughout the fort. Prisoner roll call follows guard deployment by exactly 11 minutes, timing calculated to ensure that security positions are fully manned before potentially dangerous individuals begin moving through the complex. The prisoners emerge from underground cells in groups of 6, moving through passages too narrow to permit side-by-side conversation, too curved to allow visual contact between groups separated by more than 3 meters. The mathematical precision of dehumanization reveals itself in the scheduling. Each prisoner receives 4 minutes and 20 seconds for morning ablutions, sufficient time to prevent health problems that might create administrative complications, insufficient time to develop routines that might restore dignity or personal autonomy. Water allocation follows the same calculating logic. 2 liters for drinking, distributed at 4-hour intervals, plus additional rations for washing, determined by behavioral compliance scores recorded daily by guards trained to recognize signs of emerging resistance. The guards learn to read human deterioration like a technical manual. Week 1. Defiance, anger, attempts to maintain personal dignity through small acts of rebellion. Week 3. Bargaining, attempts to negotiate better treatment through cooperation or information. Week 7. Depression, withdrawal, the gradual acceptance of powerlessness. Week 12. Institutionalization, the psychological state in which prisoners begin to find comfort in routine and to fear the uncertainty that freedom might represent. But the system demands more than passive compliance. It requires active participation in the machinery of oppression. Prisoners who demonstrate complete submission receive opportunities to earn privileges by reporting on other prisoners, by assisting with maintenance work that keeps the detention systems operational, or by participating in the elaborate ceremonies that transform individual suffering into public education. The selection process for these collaborators follows protocols developed through systematic experimentation. Guards identify prisoners who retain enough intelligence to be useful but have lost enough hope to be reliable. The chosen individuals receive slightly better food, slightly more water, and the illusion of authority over other prisoners, just enough improvement in their circumstances to create psychological investment in the system's continued operation. These prisoner collaborators learn to administer the daily routines that break down resistance in new arrivals. They distribute food according to behavioral compliance schedules. They explain the rules that govern survival. They demonstrate through their own broken example what cooperation can achieve and what defiance costs. Most insidiously, they learn to take pride in their efficiency, to measure their own worth by their success in transforming other human beings into compliant components of institutional machinery. The acoustic architecture serves purposes beyond surveillance. The curved corridors that carry guard commands also carry the sounds of suffering from detention areas to cells throughout the complex. Every scream becomes educational. Every plea for mercy demonstrates the futility of resistance. Every breakdown teaches incoming prisoners what awaits them if they fail to adapt quickly enough to institutional expectations. But the sound system creates opportunities for psychological warfare that transcend simple intimidation. Guards learn to time interrogations to coincide with meal distribution, ensuring that prisoners must choose between eating and listening to the suffering of others. The forced choice between personal survival and emotional solidarity creates psychological stress that accelerates the breakdown of group cohesion among prisoners. The underground chambers reveal their full horror through the details that administrative records catalog with bureaucratic precision. Chamber dimensions: 3 meters by 2 meters by 2.5 meters high. Sufficient space for one person to lie down. Insufficient space for 2 people to avoid physical contact. Inadequate space for sustained standing without developing circulation problems that become medical emergencies within 72 hours. Ventilation follows engineering principles borrowed from mine construction. Air enters through channels carved at floor level, circulates through the chamber, and exits through openings positioned near the ceiling. The system prevents suffocation while maintaining carbon dioxide levels high enough to induce persistent headaches, shortened attention spans, and the kind of mental fog that makes complex thinking difficult. Temperature control serves similar purposes. The thermal mass of surrounding stone ensures that underground chambers remain cool enough to prevent heat stroke but warm enough to prevent hypothermia. The resulting environment creates persistent discomfort without producing medical emergencies that might require intervention from outside physicians who could document conditions and potentially report abuses to imperial oversight authorities. The drainage system handles both sanitation and the byproducts of interrogation, with engineering precision that suggests systematic planning rather than ad hoc adaptation. Channels carved into the stone floors connect each chamber to a central drainage tunnel that carries waste away from inhabited areas, while preventing backflow that might create health hazards for guards or administrative personnel. But the drainage serves another purpose. It eliminates evidence. Blood, vomit, urine, and other biological evidence of what happens in these spaces disappears into channels that connect ultimately to the Yamuna River, where currents disperse materials downstream beyond the reach of anyone seeking to document or investigate institutional practices. The elephant training intensifies during this operational period, with protocols that transform natural animal behavior into precision instruments of state violence. The training schedule requires 6 hours daily of conditioning exercises, split between morning sessions that focus on command response and afternoon sessions that emphasize performance under stress conditions designed to simulate the chaos and noise of public executions. Morning training begins with basic obedience exercises that reinforce the handler's absolute authority over animals whose natural instincts would normally make them impossible to control. Elephants learn to suppress their instinctive responses to human distress, to ignore screams and pleas that would normally trigger protective or avoidance behaviors, and to perform complex physical actions on command, regardless of their emotional state or natural preferences. the conditioning process exploits the elephant's intelligence and emotional capacity in ways that would be impossible with less cognitively sophisticated animals. Elephants form emotional bonds with their handlers that create psychological leverage for training purposes. The animals learn to associate their handlers' approval with successful task completion, and their handlers' disappointment with failure to perform until their emotional well-being becomes dependent on their willingness to participate in acts that violate their natural behavioral patterns. Advanced training introduces what administrative documents describe as precision applications, exercises that teach elephants to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to achieve specific results. Too little pressure fails to accomplish the intended educational purpose. Too much pressure creates administrative complications by making the proceedings too disturbing for observers to watch without psychological trauma that might compromise their reliability as witnesses. The elephants learn to distinguish between different types of human subjects and to modify their behavior accordingly. Commands delivered in specific tones teach the animals to apply different levels of force to different categories of prisoners. Young individuals require different handling than adults. Individuals who have been weakened by prolonged detention require different treatment than newly arrived prisoners who retain full physical strength. Most disturbingly, the elephants learn to recognize and respond to audience reactions during public proceedings. Training exercises include simulated crowds that cheer, gasp, or attempt to flee, and the animals learn to maintain focus on their assigned tasks despite external distractions. They learn, in short, to perform judicial murder as entertainment, responding to crowd dynamics while remaining obedient to handler commands. The handler selection process reveals the institutional sophistication required to maintain such a system. Candidates must demonstrate not only physical courage and technical skill in elephant management, but psychological resilience that allows them to participate in systematic violence without developing the kind of emotional instability that might compromise operational security. Successful handlers share certain psychological characteristics that make them suitable for the work. Capacity for compartmentalization that allows them to separate their professional duties from their personal moral reactions. Social isolation that reduces their exposure to community pressure that might create conflicting loyalties, and economic desperation that makes them dependent on institutional employment regardless of its moral costs. Training for new handlers includes gradual exposure to the full scope of their responsibilities. Initial assignments focus on routine elephant care, feeding, cleaning, basic health maintenance. Only after candidates demonstrate complete reliability in these areas do their duties expand to include participation in training exercises that prepare elephants for judicial applications. The final phase of handler training requires direct participation in executions, initially as assistants to experienced handlers, eventually as primary operators responsible for commanding elephants during public proceedings. This progression ensures that handlers develop the necessary psychological conditioning gradually, reducing the risk of emotional breakdowns that might occur if they were exposed too rapidly to the full horror of their institutional role. The psychological toll on handlers manifests in predictable ways that administrative oversight has learned to monitor and manage. Increased alcohol consumption, social withdrawal, episodes of violence against family members, and the development of callousness that extends beyond professional requirements to affect all personal relationships. The institution accepts these costs as inevitable consequences of necessary work, providing just enough support to maintain handler effectiveness while avoiding interventions that might encourage moral reflection or emotional recovery. The first maintenance crisis occurs during the monsoon season of 1569, when seasonal flooding creates conditions that test every system the fort's designers built into the complex. Water enters through microscopic cracks in stonework that seemed solid during construction, but proved vulnerable to sustained moisture under pressure from unprecedented rainfall that turns streets into rivers and rivers into inland seas. The underground chambers flood partially, forcing emergency evacuation of prisoners to above-ground facilities that lack adequate security infrastructure for long-term detention. Guards work 18-hour shifts to compensate for security vulnerabilities created by overcrowding in spaces not designed to accommodate the fort's full prisoner population simultaneously. But the flooding creates opportunities for what administrative records describe as accelerated processing of pending judicial cases. Prisoners whose cases might normally require weeks of deliberation receive expedited hearings and immediate sentences during the emergency period when normal oversight procedures cannot be maintained due to weather-related communication difficulties. The elephant quarters flood completely, forcing temporary relocation of animals to the main courtyard, where they must be restrained using chains and tethers, rather than the permanent containment systems built into their normal enclosures. The change in environment disrupts training schedules and creates stress behaviors in animals whose conditioning depends on environmental consistency and predictable routine. Handler mortality increases during this period due to accidents involving animals stressed by changed conditions and emergency restraint systems not designed for extended use. 3 handlers die from injuries sustained while attempting to control elephants exhibiting panic behaviors triggered by flooding, confined spaces, and irregular feeding schedules that disrupt the psychological conditioning that normally ensures human safety during animal handling operations. The deaths force recruitment of replacement handlers from outside the fort's normal employment networks, bringing individuals into the system who lack the gradual conditioning that typically prepares employees for participation in judicial proceedings. These emergency hires require accelerated training that increases error rates and creates security risks during the period when their psychological adaptation to institutional requirements remains incomplete. Recovery from the flooding crisis requires systematic rebuilding of both physical infrastructure and human systems damaged by the emergency period. Drainage improvements prevent similar problems during future monsoons, but the psychological impact on personnel, guards, handlers, administrators, and prisoners creates lasting changes in institutional culture that affect fort operations for years afterward. The crisis demonstrates the fragility of systems that depend on environmental control to maintain human compliance. When floods disrupt routine, when security systems fail, when normal containment procedures become impossible, the careful balance between fear and hope that makes institutional control possible begins to shift in dangerous directions. Workers discover that guards exhausted by emergency schedules become less vigilant. Prisoners discover that handlers, stressed by animal management crises, become less precise in their supervision. Administrative personnel discover that record-keeping systems designed for normal operations cannot track individual cases effectively during periods when emergency processing accelerates judicial timelines beyond the capacity of existing documentation procedures. Most significantly, everyone involved discovers that the institutional machinery they have learned to trust as permanent and inescapable can be disrupted by forces beyond human control. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be measured in administrative reports, but it manifests in increased security incidents, handler errors, and prisoner resistance behaviors that suggest growing awareness that the system's power is not absolute. The recovery period requires systematic re-establishment of institutional control through demonstration of renewed capability. Public executions increase in frequency and severity during the months following the flooding, designed to re-establish psychological dominance over populations that may have begun to question institutional invincibility during the crisis period. The elephants require retraining to restore precision behaviors compromised by the stress and disruption of emergency relocation. Handlers require counseling and supervision to address psychological impacts that manifest as increased error rates and decreased reliability during high-stress operations. Guards require additional discipline and surveillance to counteract the relaxation of standards that occurred during the emergency period when normal oversight became impossible, but the system adapts. Institutional machinery designed to survive challenges from human resistance proves capable of adapting to challenges from natural forces. New procedures, improved infrastructure, and reinforced psychological conditioning create an institutional culture more resilient than what existed before the crisis. The fort emerges from its first major test stronger, more sophisticated, and more capable of maintaining control under adverse conditions. The machine has learned to repair itself, to adapt to unexpected challenges, and to convert crisis into opportunity for institutional growth and improved effectiveness. Now it prepares to demonstrate these enhanced capabilities through a comprehensive exhibition designed to impress regional authorities, intimidate potential challengers, and establish institutional reputation that will deter resistance throughout the broader imperial territory. The demonstration will require perfect coordination between all elements of the institutional machinery: guards, handlers, elephants, prisoners, and the architectural systems that transform individual components into a unified instrument of state power. It will require performance under observation by audiences whose political importance makes failure unacceptable. The stakes could not be higher. Success will establish the fort's reputation as an instrument of imperial control that can be relied upon regardless of circumstances. Failure will invite challenges from enemies who may conclude that institutional power is more fragile than its reputation suggests. The machine prepares to prove itself worthy of the Empire's trust and the Empire's enemies' fear. The daily rhythm of terror develops its own metabolism during the second year of operation. Guards learn to recognize the subtle signs that distinguish between prisoners who will break within days and those who will require weeks of systematic pressure. The recognition becomes instinctive. The way a person holds their shoulders, the speed of their eye movements, the unconscious gestures that betray whether someone still believes rescue is possible or has begun the psychological process of accepting permanent captivity. Breaking the strong ones requires different techniques than breaking the weak ones. Physical violence applied too early hardens resistance. Applied too late, it becomes unnecessary. The guards develop an intuitive understanding of timing that transforms brutality from crude force into precise instrument, calibrated to achieve maximum psychological impact with minimum administrative complications. The strong prisoners, those who arrive with political connections, military training, or religious convictions that provide psychological frameworks for resistance, receive specialized treatment designed to systematically dismantle their sources of inner strength. Their religious artifacts are confiscated, then returned damaged. Their political allies are mentioned by name during interrogations, suggesting institutional knowledge of their entire networks. Their military skills are mocked through elaborate demonstrations that show how easily their training can be neutralized by institutional advantages. But the institutional advantage extends beyond physical superiority. The fort's greatest weapon against strong prisoners is time itself. Religious conviction that sustains resistance for weeks weakens after months of isolation from religious community. Political loyalty that provides meaning during initial detention erodes when political allies fail to organize rescue attempts. Military pride that maintains discipline during early interrogations crumbles when prisoners are forced to witness their own progressive physical and mental deterioration. The weak prisoners, those who arrive already broken by previous detention, torture, or personal loss, require different handling. Violence applied to people who have already accepted their powerlessness becomes counterproductive, potentially triggering psychological collapse that interferes with information extraction or public demonstration purposes. Instead, weak prisoners receive just enough improvement in their circumstances to create hope, then systematic removal of privileges that teaches them to associate survival with compliance. The institutional learning curve reveals itself in statistical records that administrators maintain with accounting precision. Average time from initial detention to complete psychological submission: 47 days for individuals with no military training, 71 days for former soldiers, 112 days for religious leaders whose faith provides systematic resistance to despair. But the statistics also reveal individual variations that require customized approaches. Some prisoners break within hours when exposed to specific psychological pressures that target their particular vulnerabilities. Others maintain resistance for months despite treatment that would destroy most people within weeks. The institution learns to identify these variations quickly and to apply appropriate techniques without wasting resources on methods that prove ineffective for particular psychological types. The classification system develops its own vocabulary that allows guards to communicate about prisoners without revealing operational details to unauthorized personnel. Morning types break quickly when exposed to sleep deprivation. Social types collapse when isolated from human contact. Physical types surrender when subjected to environmental stress that doesn't involve direct violence, but creates sustained discomfort that demonstrates their complete powerlessness over their own bodily experience. The elephant training reaches new levels of sophistication as handlers learn to exploit not just the animal's intelligence, but their emotional capacity in ways that serve institutional purposes. Elephants develop emotional bonds with specific handlers that create psychological leverage for advanced training applications. The animals learn to associate their handler's emotional state with their own well-being, until animal cooperation becomes motivated by genuine affection corrupted into institutional service. Advanced conditioning exploits these emotional bonds through systematic manipulation of reward and punishment cycles that mirror the techniques used on human prisoners. Elephants receive maximum attention and care when they perform institutional tasks flawlessly. They experience social isolation and reduced feeding when their performance fails to meet training standards. Most significantly, they learn to recognize when their handlers are pleased versus disappointed, and they develop emotional investment in maintaining handler approval, regardless of the moral content of the behaviors required to earn that approval. The psychological sophistication of elephant training becomes apparent during advanced exercises that teach animals to modulate their behavior based on audience reactions during public proceedings. Elephants learn to read crowd dynamics, to respond to handler signals that indicate whether proceedings should be extended for maximum educational impact or abbreviated if audience distress threatens to become counterproductive. The animals develop what can only be described as performance sensitivity, the ability to adjust their behavior in real time to maximize the psychological impact on observers while maintaining technical precision required for institutional purposes. They learn to pause between actions to allow audience reactions, to respond to handler cues about pacing and intensity, and to maintain focus on their assigned tasks despite external distractions that would normally trigger natural behavioral responses. Most disturbingly, some elephants begin to exhibit what handlers recognize as anticipatory behavior during preparation for judicial proceedings. The animals demonstrate excitement, increased energy levels, and focused attention that suggests they have learned to find satisfaction in activities that violate their natural behavioral patterns. The institutional conditioning has succeeded so thoroughly that participation in state violence has become, for these animals, a source of genuine pleasure rather than mere compliance with unavoidable commands. The handler psychology evolves in parallel with animal conditioning, creating human-elephant partnerships that achieve institutional objectives through shared psychological investment in successful performance. Handlers develop genuine pride in their animals' capabilities and genuine affection for creatures whose intelligence and emotional responsiveness make them effective partners in work that requires both technical precision and psychological sophistication. But this emotional investment creates psychological dependencies that serve institutional control objectives. Handlers become emotionally attached to animals whose well-being depends on continued institutional employment. They develop professional identities that depend on success in work that cannot be performed outside the institutional context. Most importantly, they learn to measure their own worth by their effectiveness in tasks that society would condemn if performed by individuals acting independently rather than institutional agents. The emotional bonds between handlers and elephants become tools of institutional control over human behavior. Handlers who might otherwise experience moral qualms about their work learn to justify their participation as necessary care for animals they genuinely love. The rationalization that they are protecting their animals from less competent or less caring handlers allows handlers to maintain psychological comfort while participating in activities that would otherwise create unbearable cognitive dissonance. The workspace modifications during this period reveal the institutional learning that occurs when theoretical systems encounter operational realities. The original execution area in the main courtyard proves inadequate for managing crowd control, during proceedings that attract larger audiences than initial planning anticipated. Modifications include elevated platforms for distinguished observers, designated standing areas for different classes of witnesses, and improved drainage systems that handle increased volume of biological materials requiring disposal. But the modifications also include architectural changes designed to optimize psychological impact on observers. Sight lines are adjusted to ensure that all audience members have clear views of proceedings, while preventing anyone from positioning themselves too close to animals or handlers. Acoustic modifications amplify certain sounds while dampening others, ensuring that audience members hear commands, impacts, and institutional commentary, while minimizing exposure to sounds that might trigger sympathy rather than appropriate fear. The audience management system develops its own protocols for different types of observers. Diplomatic representatives receive positions that demonstrate respect for their status while ensuring they witness enough detail to report accurately to their governments about institutional capabilities. Regional governors receive treatment that acknowledges their authority while demonstrating the superior power of imperial institutions. Local officials receive positions that reinforce their subordinate status while providing them with experiences that will help them maintain order in their own jurisdictions. But the most sophisticated audience management focuses on the general population: merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and others whose cooperation maintains economic and social stability throughout the region. These observers receive carefully controlled exposure to institutional power that teaches appropriate lessons without creating trauma that might interfere with their productive economic activity. The balance requires institutional sophistication that transforms public execution from crude intimidation into sophisticated psychological education. Observers must witness enough violence to understand the consequences of resistance, but not so much violence that they become psychologically incapacitated for normal social and economic function. They must experience enough fear to deter future resistance, but not so much fear that they lose the capacity for hope that makes productive work possible. The timing of public proceedings follows administrative schedules designed to maximize educational impact while minimizing economic disruption. Executions occur on market days when large numbers of people gather for commercial purposes, ensuring maximum audience size without requiring special travel that might create logistical complications. The timing also ensures that observers return immediately to their normal economic activities, carrying fresh memories of institutional power into their daily interactions with family, neighbors, and business associates. The seasonal schedule accommodates agricultural rhythms that govern rural life throughout the region. Proceedings increase in frequency during harvest seasons, when farmers gather in towns to sell crops and purchase supplies for the coming year. Winter executions occur less frequently because travel difficulties reduce audience sizes below the minimum required for effective educational impact. But the schedule also accommodates political rhythms that govern imperial administration. Executions increase before major policy announcements that might provoke resistance, ensuring that potential opponents understand the consequences of organized opposition. Proceedings decrease during periods when imperial forces are engaged elsewhere, preventing institutional overextension that might create opportunities for local challenges to authority. The record-keeping system develops new categories as administrators learn to document institutional performance with scientific precision. Statistics track not just completion rates and operational costs, but psychological outcomes measured through behavioral indicators that suggest educational effectiveness. Post-execution surveys of merchant activity, crime rates, and tax compliance provide data about community-wide psychological impacts that help administrators adjust future operations for optimal results. The documentation includes detailed analysis of individual audience reactions categorized by social class, economic status, political affiliation, and previous exposure to institutional demonstrations. Administrators learn to recognize which types of observers require exposure to different levels of institutional power to achieve appropriate behavioral modification, and they adjust invitation lists and seating arrangements to ensure optimal audience composition for specific educational objectives. Most importantly, the records track long-term behavioral changes in communities that receive regular exposure to institutional power versus those that receive only occasional demonstrations. The data suggests that psychological impact diminishes over time without reinforcement, but that excessive frequency creates adaptation responses that reduce effectiveness. Optimal deterrent impact requires carefully calculated exposure schedules that maintain fear without creating habituation. The infrastructure improvements during this period focus on sustainability features that ensure long-term institutional effectiveness. Water systems are upgraded to handle increased volume and improved waste disposal requirements. Storage facilities are expanded to accommodate larger populations and longer detention periods. Living quarters for guards and handlers are improved to reduce turnover rates and maintain operational continuity during periods of high institutional activity. But the most significant improvements focus on systems that reduce administrative overhead while maintaining operational security. Automated locks reduce the number of personnel required for routine security functions. Improved food preparation facilities increase efficiency while reducing opportunities for prisoner contact with support staff who might develop inappropriate emotional attachments. Enhanced communication systems ensure rapid coordination between different sections of the fort during high-stress operations. The improvements also include psychological amenities designed to maintain staff morale during work that creates persistent emotional stress. Recreational facilities provide guards and handlers with opportunities for stress relief that reduce error rates and personnel conflicts. Improved medical care addresses both physical injuries and psychological symptoms that interfere with professional effectiveness. Educational programs help staff develop intellectual frameworks that justify their participation in work that might otherwise create moral conflicts. The staff development system creates career paths that provide institutional loyalty through opportunities for advancement within the specialized professional hierarchy that emerges around detention and execution operations. Guards can advance to supervisory positions that provide increased authority and compensation. Handlers can specialize in advanced animal training techniques that create professional expertise valued throughout the imperial system. Administrators can develop policy and planning skills that prepare them for leadership positions in similar institutions throughout the empire. The career incentives create psychological investment in institutional success that transcends immediate financial compensation. Staff develop professional identities that depend on continued institutional operation and growth. They acquire specialized skills that have value only within institutional contexts. Most significantly, they develop social relationships and professional networks that isolate them from civilian populations while embedding them more deeply in institutional culture. The isolation serves institutional control purposes by reducing staff exposure to moral and emotional influences that might create conflicts with professional duties. Staff live within institutional housing, eat institutional food, and socialize primarily with institutional colleagues who share similar work experiences. Their children attend institutional schools that prepare them for similar careers. Their families receive medical care through institutional facilities that create additional layers of dependency on continued institutional employment. The systematic isolation creates institutional communities that develop their own cultural norms, moral frameworks, and social hierarchies independent of civilian society. Staff learn to measure success, failure, virtue, and vice according to institutional standards that prioritize operational effectiveness over civilian moral considerations. They develop professional pride in work that civilian populations would condemn, and they learn to view civilian moral objections as evidence of ignorance about the necessities of maintaining imperial order. The institutional culture reaches maturity when staff no longer require external supervision to maintain professional standards during high-stress operations. Guards automatically assume appropriate positions during emergency situations without awaiting orders. Handlers respond instinctively to animal behavioral indicators that suggest potential problems during public proceedings. Administrators make resource allocation decisions that prioritize institutional effectiveness over individual comfort or civilian convenience. The cultural maturity manifests in seamless coordination between different operational components during complex proceedings that require precise timing and flawless execution. The institution has become more than the sum of its individual personnel. It has developed emergent properties that allow it to function as a unified organism, capable of adapting to unexpected challenges while maintaining focus on core operational objectives. The machine has learned to think, to adapt, and to improve itself through systematic analysis of operational experience. Now it prepares to demonstrate these capabilities through a comprehensive exhibition that will establish its reputation throughout the imperial system and beyond. The exhibition will require performance under conditions of unprecedented scrutiny, with audiences that include imperial officials whose political importance makes success mandatory and failure potentially catastrophic for everyone involved in institutional operations. The stakes extend beyond mere institutional reputation to encompass the personal survival of staff whose careers, families, and futures depend on continued institutional success. Every element of institutional machinery must function flawlessly. Every detail of operational procedure must achieve perfect execution. Every aspect of psychological impact must produce intended results in audiences whose reactions will determine institutional funding, staffing, and political support for years to come. The machine stands ready to prove itself worthy of the Empire's confidence and the Empire's enemies' terror. The hinge fails at 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in August 1573. Not the massive gates that tourists photograph, but a small maintenance access door in the northeastern wall, 18-gauge iron, 43 centimeters wide, secured by a lock mechanism that had functioned flawlessly for 2,112 days of continuous operation. The failure begins with thermal expansion. August temperatures reach 51 degrees Celsius during afternoon hours, causing metal components to expand beyond the tolerances built into lock mechanisms designed for more moderate climate conditions. The expansion creates microscopic stress fractures in the iron bolt that secures the door's primary locking mechanism. But thermal stress alone wouldn't cause catastrophic failure. The problem compounds when the evening cooling cycle contracts the metal faster than the lock mechanism can accommodate. The stress fracture propagates through the iron bolt over the course of 6 cooling cycles, creating a weakness that finally fails when a guard attempts to secure the lock during routine patrol procedures. The failure produces a sound, a sharp metallic snap followed by the scrape of unsecured metal against stone, that carries through corridor acoustics designed to amplify precisely these kinds of security-relevant audio signatures. 3 guards hear the sound simultaneously from different positions within the fort, but none initially recognizes it as indicating lock failure, because the sound doesn't match the acoustic signatures they've been trained to identify as security emergencies. The recognition delay lasts 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the northeastern maintenance access remains unsecured, while guards attempt to identify the source of an unfamiliar sound that clearly indicates some kind of equipment failure, but doesn't immediately suggest the specific nature or location of the problem. Guard training protocols require immediate investigation of any unidentified mechanical sounds, but the protocols assume that guards can quickly locate the source of such sounds using standard search procedures. The northeastern maintenance access, however, is positioned in a corridor section that creates acoustic confusion. Sounds originating there seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously, making precise localization difficult even for guards with extensive experience in the fort's acoustic environment. The 11-minute delay violates multiple security protocols simultaneously. Guards are supposed to identify and secure any equipment failures within 5 minutes of detection. They are supposed to report any unresolved security issues to supervisory personnel within 7 minutes of initial detection. Most critically, they are supposed to assume hostile action as the cause of any security anomaly that cannot be quickly explained through routine equipment problems. But the failure occurs during a night shift rotation that places the fort's least experienced guards in critical security positions. The senior guards who might recognize the significance of the acoustic anomaly are off-duty, sleeping in quarters sufficiently distant from the failure location that the sound doesn't wake them. The guards on duty have been working night shifts for less than 6 months and lack the institutional memory required to recognize subtle indicators of serious security problems. The inexperience shows in their initial response. Instead of immediately assuming hostile action and implementing lockdown procedures, They spend the 11-minute delay attempting to diagnose the equipment failure as a routine maintenance issue that can be addressed through standard repair procedures. Their assumption that the problem is mechanical rather than security-related delays implementation of protocols that might prevent the situation from deteriorating. When Guard Supervisor Krishnan finally locates the failed lock at 3:28 in the morning, his initial response demonstrates the psychological conditioning that 18 months of routine operation has created in institutional personnel. His first concern is not security implications but administrative consequences: the paperwork required to document equipment failure, the resource allocation necessary to obtain replacement hardware, and the potential disciplinary action that might result from his failure to prevent the equipment breakdown. The administrative focus delays security response by an additional 4 minutes, while Krishnan examines the failed lock mechanism to determine whether temporary repairs might avoid the bureaucratic complications associated with formal security incidents. Only when he realizes that the bolt has fractured completely, making temporary repair impossible, does he begin implementing security protocols designed for equipment failures that create actual security vulnerabilities. But the protocols assume that security personnel will respond immediately to supervisor commands issued during emergency situations. The night shift guards, however, have not experienced actual security emergencies during their tenure at the fort. Their response to Krishnan's emergency commands is hesitant, uncertain, and slow, precisely the kind of response that security protocols are designed to prevent through training exercises that institutional budget constraints have postponed repeatedly due to resource allocation priorities that favor operational activities over preparedness training. The Guard response reveals systematic training deficiencies that compromise security effectiveness throughout the fort. Guards fail to secure assigned positions within required time frames. They fail to implement communication protocols that ensure coordination between different sections of the fort during emergency operations. Most critically, they fail to maintain the psychological state of controlled readiness that enables rapid response to unexpected security challenges. The psychological conditioning that makes guards effective during routine operations actually impedes their effectiveness during emergency situations. The same mental discipline that enables them to maintain focus during repetitive security duties creates rigidity that prevents rapid adaptation to unprecedented circumstances. Guards trained to follow precise protocols in predictable situations struggle to improvise solutions when circumstances don't match their training scenarios. The equipment failure exposes broader systemic vulnerabilities that institutional administrators have ignored because routine operations have proceeded smoothly enough to suggest that security systems are functioning adequately. But the smooth operation has occurred only because the security systems have never faced serious challenges, not because the systems are inherently robust or capable of adapting to unexpected stress conditions. The northeastern access door serves maintenance functions that seem peripheral to core security operations, but actually provide critical support for systems throughout the fort. Maintenance crews use the access to service water distribution systems, waste disposal infrastructure, and mechanical components that keep the fort operational on a daily basis. Loss of access to these systems creates cascading problems that affect security operations even though the initial failure seems unrelated to detention or execution functions. Water distribution problems develop within hours of the access failure because maintenance crews cannot reach valve controls that regulate flow throughout the fort's internal systems. Without proper valve control, water pressure becomes irregular, creating supply problems in guard quarters, prisoner detention areas, and elephant care facilities. The water problems create operational stress that affects personnel performance and animal behavior in ways that compromise overall institutional effectiveness. Waste disposal problems develop more slowly but with more serious long-term consequences. Without access to maintenance systems, waste from detention areas begins accumulating in ways that create health hazards, odor problems, and the kind of unsanitary conditions that affect personnel morale and potentially compromise the fort's reputation with external observers who might report sanitation problems to imperial oversight authorities. But the most serious consequence is psychological. The equipment failure demonstrates to institutional personnel that systems they have learned to trust as permanent and inescapable can fail without warning in ways that create opportunities for prisoners, challengers, or enemies seeking to exploit institutional vulnerabilities. The psychological impact cannot be measured in administrative reports, but it manifests in increased anxiety levels among guards, increased disciplinary problems among prisoners who sense institutional uncertainty, and increased stress among handlers whose animal management responsibilities become more difficult when institutional routine is disrupted. The repair process requires resources and expertise that institutional planners assumed would be readily available when needed, but which prove difficult to obtain during an actual emergency. The fort's maintenance staff includes personnel capable of routine repairs but lacks individuals with specialized knowledge required for emergency reconstruction of security-critical systems. External expertise must be brought in from regional centers, creating security risks associated with admitting outsiders to institutional facilities during periods of vulnerability. The outside specialists require security clearances, background investigations, and supervision protocols that delay repairs while creating additional administrative workload during a period when security personnel are already stressed by emergency response duties. The clearance process reveals bureaucratic inefficiencies that have developed during routine operations when administrative speed seemed less critical than administrative thoroughness. But the specialists also provide unwelcome external perspective on institutional operations. Their presence during repair activities exposes them to aspects of fort operations that institutional personnel prefer to keep confidential. The specialists observe security procedures, detention conditions, and operational practices that might be reported to outside authorities or discussed in civilian contexts where institutional activities are subjected to moral scrutiny that could create political problems. The repair timeline extends to 17 days. 17 days during which the northeastern access remains partially secured through temporary measures that compromise security effectiveness while creating additional workload for guards who must compensate through increased surveillance and more frequent patrols. The additional duties create fatigue problems that affect guard performance and increase error rates during critical security operations. Personnel stress manifests in behavioral changes that supervisors recognize as indicators of declining institutional effectiveness. Guards become more irritable with each other and with prisoners, creating disciplinary problems that require additional supervisory intervention. Handlers report increased difficulty controlling elephants whose behavior responds to environmental stress and disrupted routine in ways that compromise training effectiveness. Administrators work longer hours attempting to manage crisis-related problems while maintaining normal operational schedules. The stress responses create feedback loops that amplify rather than resolve operational problems. Irritable guards create prisoner management problems that require additional security measures, which increase guard workload, which creates additional irritability. Stressed handlers make animal management errors that create safety problems, which require additional precautionary measures, which increase handler workload and stress levels. Overworked administrators make resource allocation decisions that prioritize immediate problem solving over long-term operational effectiveness. The crisis management reveals institutional culture problems that successful routine operations have concealed. Personnel have learned to function effectively when institutional systems provide clear guidance and predictable support, but they struggle to maintain effectiveness when circumstances require initiative, improvisation, or independent judgment. The same institutional culture that ensures reliable performance during normal operations creates dependency that becomes problematic when normal operations are disrupted. Communication systems fail under crisis stress in ways that suggest fundamental design inadequacies in institutional information management. The protocols that ensure effective coordination during routine operations assume that communication channels will function normally and that personnel will respond predictably to standard commands. When crisis conditions create communication delays, equipment failures, and personnel stress that affect response times and decision-making capability, the communication systems prove inadequate for maintaining coordination under adverse conditions. The information flow problems create dangerous misunderstandings about security status, resource availability, and personnel assignments that compromise operational effectiveness precisely when effectiveness is most critical. Guards receive contradictory orders from different supervisors, attempting to coordinate crisis response without adequate information about actions taken by other sections of the fort. Handlers receive incomplete information about security status changes that affect animal management requirements during emergency conditions. Most critically, administrators lack real-time information about the cumulative impact of individual crisis responses on overall institutional capability. Decision-makers implementing crisis management measures cannot assess whether their decisions are solving problems or creating additional problems, because information systems designed for routine operations cannot provide the kind of comprehensive situational awareness required for effective crisis management. The prisoner population responds to institutional uncertainty with behavioral changes that create additional security challenges precisely when security resources are already strained by crisis management requirements. Prisoners who have learned to gauge institutional strength through environmental indicators recognize that something abnormal is occurring even though they lack specific information about the nature of the security problems. The recognition manifests in subtle behavioral changes that experienced guards learn to interpret as indicators of potential resistance activity. Prisoners become more attentive to guard movements and conversations. They show increased interest in routine activities that might provide information about institutional operations. Most concerning, they begin attempting to communicate with each other despite security protocols designed to prevent coordination between prisoners that might facilitate organized resistance efforts. The communication attempts occur through methods that prisoners have developed during routine detention, but which they previously used only for emotional support rather than information sharing or resistance coordination. Gesture systems, verbal codes, and timing patterns that seemed harmless during normal operations become potential security threats when used by prisoners who sense institutional vulnerability and seek to exploit opportunities for escape or resistance. Security protocols designed for routine operations prove inadequate for managing prisoner populations that are actively seeking to exploit institutional vulnerabilities during crisis periods. The protocols assume that prisoners will remain passive and compliant as long as routine security measures continue functioning normally. When crisis conditions disrupt normal security operations, prisoners become more active in testing boundaries and probing for weaknesses that might provide escape opportunities or tactical advantages. The testing behavior forces guards to implement enhanced security measures precisely when their resources are already strained by crisis management responsibilities. Additional patrols, increased surveillance, and more frequent prisoner counts require personnel time and attention that would otherwise be available for crisis response activities. The enhanced measures also create additional stress for guards who must maintain alertness for potential security threats while simultaneously managing crisis-related duties. But enhanced security measures also create new vulnerabilities because they disrupt established routines that prisoners have learned to navigate safely. When security procedures change suddenly, prisoners must adapt to new rules and expectations, while guards must learn to implement unfamiliar protocols under stress conditions. The adaptation period creates opportunities for misunderstandings, errors, and conflicts that can escalate into serious security incidents. The elephant behavior deteriorates as institutional stress affects handler performance and disrupts environmental conditions that trained animals require for psychological stability. Elephants respond to handler anxiety, irregular feeding schedules, and environmental changes with stress behaviors that compromise training effectiveness and create safety hazards during routine handling operations. Handler stress manifests in subtle changes in voice tone, body language, and behavioral patterns that elephants detect and interpret as indicators of environmental threat. The animals respond with defensive behaviors, increased vigilance, and reduced willingness to perform trained behaviors that require them to trust handler commands during potentially dangerous activities. The trust erosion creates safety problems during routine animal care and makes it impossible to maintain the precision behavioral control required for judicial applications. The behavioral deterioration forces handlers to implement modified training protocols designed to restore animal confidence and compliance. but the modification process requires time and resources that are not available during crisis management periods. Handlers must choose between maintaining animal training standards and performing crisis management duties, creating operational compromises that affect institutional capability in both areas. Animal stress also affects elephant health in ways that create additional veterinary requirements during periods when medical resources are already strained by crisis-related personnel injuries and health problems. Stress-related digestive problems, behavioral disorders, and immune system suppression require medical attention that diverts resources from human medical needs while creating additional workload for veterinary personnel, whose expertise is critical for maintaining institutional capability. The health problems create cascading effects throughout the institutional animal management system. Sick elephants cannot perform trained behaviors, requiring adjustments to judicial schedules that affect prisoner management, audience coordination, and administrative planning. Veterinary treatment requires isolation of affected animals, reducing the number of elephants available for training and operational activities. Most critically, animal health problems create visible indicators of institutional stress that external observers might interpret as evidence of declining institutional effectiveness. The crisis reaches critical intensity when multiple system failures occur simultaneously during the 13th day of the repair period. A water distribution failure creates supply problems throughout the fort, just as summer heat reaches peak intensity, creating health hazards that require immediate attention from personnel already strained by ongoing crisis management duties. Prisoner disciplinary problems escalate into a confrontation that requires emergency response procedures, drawing guards away from other security duties at precisely the moment when enhanced surveillance is most critical. The simultaneous failures overwhelm institutional capacity to respond effectively to individual problems while maintaining overall operational capability. Personnel must choose between addressing immediate crises and maintaining minimum security standards, creating operational compromises that increase vulnerability to additional problems. The crisis management becomes reactive rather than proactive as administrators lose the ability to anticipate and prevent problems before they become emergencies. Most critically, the accumulated stress begins affecting personnel judgment in ways that create serious errors during critical decision-making processes. Exhausted administrators make resource allocation decisions without adequate consideration of long-term consequences. Stressed guards make tactical decisions based on immediate pressure relief rather than strategic security requirements. Overwhelmed handlers make animal management decisions that prioritize short-term convenience over long-term training effectiveness. The error cascade creates feedback loops that amplify rather than resolve crisis conditions. Poor resource allocation decisions create additional operational problems that require more resources to resolve. Tactical security errors create vulnerabilities that require additional security measures to address. Animal management errors compromise institutional capabilities that would otherwise help resolve other aspects of the crisis. The institutional machinery begins consuming itself, using resources and energy to manage crisis-related problems that were created by previous crisis management decisions. The system enters a destructive cycle where each solution creates new problems that require additional solutions that create additional problems. The crisis management becomes the primary institutional function, displacing the operational activities that provide institutional purpose and justify institutional existence. Emergency protocols designed for short-term crisis resolution prove inadequate for managing sustained crisis conditions that extend beyond the duration assumed by institutional planners. The protocols exhaust personnel reserves, deplete resource stockpiles, and strain infrastructure beyond sustainable limits. Most critically, they create psychological stress that affects personnel performance in ways that compound operational problems rather than resolving them. The institutional culture begins fragmenting as personnel develop conflicting priorities and competing loyalties during crisis conditions that require difficult choices between individual survival and institutional effectiveness. Guards must choose between personal safety and professional duties when security operations require them to accept elevated risks. Handlers must choose between animal welfare and institutional requirements when crisis conditions create conflicts between veterinary recommendations and operational necessities. Administrative personnel face the most difficult choices because their decisions affect entire institutional capability rather than individual operational activities. They must choose between maintaining institutional reputation and acknowledging institutional limitations when crisis management requires external assistance that might expose institutional vulnerabilities. They must choose between short-term crisis resolution and long-term institutional effectiveness when immediate solutions require resource expenditures that compromise future operational capability. The choice pressure creates moral conflicts that personnel have not experienced during routine operations when institutional procedures provide clear guidance about appropriate behavior and decision-making priorities. Crisis conditions force personnel to make independent judgments about competing priorities without institutional guidance designed for the specific circumstances they face. The moral stress manifests in psychological symptoms that affect personnel effectiveness even after immediate crisis problems are resolved. Personnel develop anxiety disorders related to their crisis experience, creating long-term health problems that require medical attention and potentially compromise their suitability for continued institutional employment. Depression and emotional withdrawal become common as personnel struggle to process the moral conflicts created by crisis decision-making requirements. But the most serious psychological impact is the erosion of confidence in institutional systems that personnel have learned to trust as permanent and reliable sources of guidance and support. When crisis conditions demonstrate that institutional systems can fail catastrophically despite careful planning and professional management, personnel begin questioning fundamental assumptions about institutional reliability and their own job security. The confidence erosion creates long-term problems that extend beyond immediate crisis resolution. Personnel who no longer trust institutional systems become less effective during routine operations because they doubt the reliability of standard procedures and question the authority of supervisory personnel. They become more likely to seek alternative employment, creating turnover problems that affect institutional capability even after crisis conditions end. Most critically, they become less committed to institutional objectives and more focused on personal survival and advantage seeking that may conflict with institutional requirements. The crisis transforms loyal institutional personnel into potential security risks, whose knowledge of institutional operations and access to institutional resources could be exploited by enemies seeking to damage institutional capability or reputation. The crisis resolution requires systematic reconstruction of institutional systems, personnel confidence, and operational capability that extends far beyond simple repair of the failed lock mechanism. The institution must rebuild not just its physical infrastructure, but its human systems, psychological culture, and reputation for reliability that provides the foundation for effective institutional operation. The reconstruction process reveals the true cost of institutional crisis, not just immediate financial expenses and operational delays, but long-term damage to institutional capability that may never be completely repaired. The crisis has taught personnel, prisoners, and external observers that institutional power is more fragile than institutional reputation suggests, creating psychological conditions that will affect institutional effectiveness for years to come. The machine has learned that it can break. Now it must learn whether it can repair itself completely enough to restore the confidence and fear that make institutional power effective. The aftermath begins with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of wrong sounds. Conversations that stop when supervisors approach, footsteps that pause at doorways, the rustle of papers being quickly concealed when authority figures enter rooms where they should be welcome. The institutional culture has developed its first secrets, and secrets are cancer in systems that depend on transparency between personnel for operational security. The silence manifests differently at different levels of institutional hierarchy. Guards whisper among themselves about whether the crisis indicates broader systemic problems that might affect their personal safety during future emergency situations. Their conversations focus on practical concerns: whether emergency protocols actually work, whether supervisory personnel will support guards who face dangerous situations, whether institutional promises about medical care and family support can be trusted when real emergencies occur. Handler conversations reveal deeper concerns about the psychological impact of crisis stress on animal behavior and their own ability to maintain control over creatures whose training effectiveness has been compromised by environmental disruption. They discuss specific behavioral changes they have observed in their elephants, compare notes about which animals have recovered normal training responsiveness and which continue to exhibit stress behaviors that affect performance reliability. But underneath these practical discussions lies a more fundamental concern: whether the institutional systems that provide their professional identity and personal security are as permanent and reliable as they had been trained to believe. The handlers have built their lives around careers that exist only within institutional contexts, and crisis-induced doubts about institutional stability threaten not just their employment, but their entire social identity and economic security. Administrative conversations occur in offices with closed doors and focus on topics that would have been unthinkable during pre-crisis operations. Resource allocation discussions include contingency planning for future emergencies that assumes institutional systems will fail again rather than assuming they will function reliably. Personnel evaluation discussions include assessments of individual psychological resilience during crisis conditions rather than focusing exclusively on routine operational competence. Most significantly, strategic planning discussions include scenarios that acknowledge institutional limitations and vulnerabilities rather than assuming unlimited institutional capability to solve problems through superior resources and systematic organization. The crisis has forced administrators to confront the possibility that their institution is not invulnerable, and this recognition affects every aspect of future planning and resource allocation. The external consequences develop more slowly, but with potentially more serious long-term implications. Regional authorities who received reports about the crisis begin conducting their own assessments of institutional reliability for tasks that require absolute dependability. The assessments focus not just on immediate crisis resolution, but on institutional capability to prevent similar failures in future operations that might affect broader imperial security interests. Imperial oversight personnel initiate investigations that examine not just the specific equipment failure, but the institutional systems and personnel decisions that allowed a minor mechanical problem to escalate into operational crisis. The investigations require institutional personnel to provide detailed documentation of their actions during crisis conditions, creating permanent records that could be used for future disciplinary actions or personnel evaluations. But the most serious external consequence is the erosion of institutional reputation among audiences whose psychological response to institutional power provides the foundation for regional stability and imperial authority. Local populations who witnessed evidence of institutional uncertainty during the crisis begin exhibiting behavioral changes that suggest decreased fear and increased willingness to test institutional boundaries through small acts of resistance or non-compliance. The behavioral changes are subtle but measurable through statistical indicators that administrators monitor as measures of regional compliance with imperial authority. Tax collection rates decline slightly as taxpayers test whether revenue enforcement will be as rigorous as usual. Crime rates increase marginally as potential criminals calculate whether punishment systems will function with normal effectiveness. Most concerning, civil dispute resolution requests decrease as local populations seek alternatives to institutional arbitration systems whose reliability they now question. The reputation damage creates feedback effects that amplify rather than resolve institutional problems. Decreased regional compliance requires additional enforcement activities that strain institutional resources during the recovery period when those resources are needed for internal reconstruction. Increased criminal activity requires additional security measures that divert personnel from normal operational duties. Alternative dispute resolution systems create parallel authority structures that compete with institutional influence in ways that could develop into more serious challenges to imperial control. The reconstruction process reveals institutional dependencies that were invisible during normal operations when all systems functioned smoothly. The fort's operational effectiveness depends on supply chains, personnel networks, and support systems that extend far beyond institutional boundaries, and over which institutional administrators exercise only limited control. When crisis conditions affect these external dependencies, institutional capability deteriorates in ways that cannot be resolved through internal management decisions alone. Supply chain disruptions occur when vendors and contractors who provide goods and services to the fort reassess the reliability of institutional payment systems and the political security of institutional relationships. Contractors who previously provided services on credit begin requiring advance payment, creating cash flow problems for institutional operations. Vendors who previously prioritized institutional orders begin treating institutional requirements as lower priority than civilian customers who seem to offer more stable business relationships. Personnel recruitment becomes more difficult as word of crisis conditions spreads through professional networks that provide skilled workers for institutional employment. Potential employees who might previously have competed for institutional positions begin seeking alternative employment that seems to offer greater job security and better working conditions. The recruitment difficulties force administrators to accept lower qualified candidates or to offer higher compensation packages that strain institutional budgets. But the most serious external dependency involves the political support systems that provide institutional authority and resources through imperial administrative channels. Crisis conditions create political vulnerabilities that opponents of institutional approaches to regional control can exploit to argue for alternative policies that might reduce institutional resources or modify institutional missions in ways that affect operational capability. Political opponents use crisis documentation to argue that institutional approaches to regional control are inherently unstable and create unnecessary risks for imperial security interests. They point to crisis costs and operational delays as evidence that institutional resources could be more effectively allocated to alternative control methods that might achieve similar results with greater reliability and lower long-term political risks. The political challenges force institutional administrators to devote increasing amounts of time and energy to political defense activities rather than operational management. They must prepare detailed reports justifying institutional effectiveness, attend political meetings where institutional policies are debated, and coordinate with political allies who support institutional approaches but who require continuous reassurance about institutional capability and reliability. The political distraction creates administrative overhead that affects institutional effectiveness even after immediate crisis problems are resolved. Administrators who should focus on operational improvement and personnel development must instead focus on political survival and reputation management. The distraction creates delays in implementing necessary reforms and improvements that could prevent future crises or enhance institutional resilience. Recovery planning reveals the true scope of institutional vulnerability by forcing administrators to confront problems that routine operations had concealed or deferred. Equipment maintenance schedules had been delayed to reduce costs during budget restrictions, creating accumulated maintenance deficits that increase the likelihood of future equipment failures. Personnel training programs had been reduced to focus resources on operational activities, creating competency gaps that affect crisis response capability. Resource allocation decisions made during normal operations had prioritized short-term operational effectiveness over long-term institutional resilience, creating systemic vulnerabilities that become apparent only when institutional systems face serious stress. The recovery process requires not just restoration of pre-crisis operational capability, but systematic addressing of underlying problems that contributed to crisis severity. The maintenance deficit reveals itself through comprehensive infrastructure inspections that identify numerous potential failure points throughout institutional systems. Water distribution components show signs of wear that could lead to supply failures similar to those that complicated crisis management. Electrical systems exhibit deterioration that could create fire hazards or communication failures during future emergency conditions, Structural elements display stress indicators that suggest potential safety problems during seismic events or extreme weather conditions. Addressing the maintenance deficit requires resource expenditures that strain institutional budgets during the recovery period when other crisis-related expenses are also requiring financial attention. Administrators must choose between immediate operational needs and long-term infrastructure improvements, creating resource allocation conflicts that affect both current operational capability and future institutional resilience. Personnel development deficits manifest through performance assessments that reveal systematic gaps in crisis management skills throughout institutional hierarchy levels. Guards lack training in emergency coordination procedures that could have prevented communication failures during crisis conditions. Handlers lack expertise in animal stress management that could have prevented behavioral problems that complicated crisis response efforts. Administrators lack crisis leadership skills that could have enabled more effective coordination of institutional response to unexpected challenges. Addressing personnel deficits requires training programs that remove personnel from operational duties during the recovery period when institutional capability is already reduced by other crisis-related problems. The training requirements create scheduling conflicts between immediate operational needs and long-term capability development that force administrators to make difficult choices about resource allocation priorities. But personnel development also reveals more fundamental problems with institutional culture that cannot be addressed through training programs alone. The crisis has exposed psychological dependencies that make institutional personnel less resilient and adaptable than effective crisis management requires. Personnel have learned to function effectively within institutional systems, but have not developed the independent judgment and personal resilience required for effective performance when institutional systems fail to provide adequate guidance and support. The psychological dependency creates performance limitations that affect institutional effectiveness even during normal operations when systems function properly. Personnel who depend on institutional guidance for decision-making become less innovative and adaptable when circumstances require creative problem-solving or independent initiative. They become less effective at identifying and addressing potential problems before they become serious enough to require formal institutional intervention. Most critically, psychological dependency creates vulnerability to future crises. Because personnel who cannot function effectively without institutional support will perform poorly when institutional systems are disrupted by unexpected challenges. The crisis has revealed that institutional personnel are simultaneously the institution's greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability, depending on whether circumstances allow institutional systems to provide adequate support for personnel effectiveness. The recovery strategy requires balancing immediate operational restoration with long-term institutional resilience enhancement in ways that address both physical infrastructure problems and human system vulnerabilities. The strategy must restore institutional capability while simultaneously improving institutional adaptability to prevent future crises from creating similar operational disruptions. Physical recovery focuses on infrastructure improvements that reduce the likelihood of equipment failures while enhancing institutional capability to respond effectively when failures do occur. Redundant systems provide backup capability when primary systems fail. Improved maintenance schedules prevent accumulation of deferred maintenance that increases failure probability. Enhanced monitoring systems provide early warning of developing problems that could escalate into serious failures if not addressed promptly. But physical improvements alone cannot address the human system vulnerabilities that contributed significantly to crisis severity. Personnel development programs must address not just technical skill deficits, but psychological resilience and independent judgment capabilities that enable effective performance during crisis conditions when institutional guidance may be inadequate or unavailable. The human system improvements require cultural changes that challenge fundamental assumptions about institutional organization and personnel management. Traditional institutional culture emphasizes compliance with established procedures and dependence on hierarchical authority for guidance and decision-making. Crisis-resilient institutional culture requires personnel who can function effectively when established procedures prove inadequate and hierarchical authority cannot provide timely guidance for rapidly evolving situations. Creating cultural change requires systematic modification of institutional practices that affect personnel psychology and professional development. Training programs must emphasize problem-solving skills and independent judgment rather than procedural compliance and authority dependence. Performance evaluations must reward innovation and adaptability rather than focusing exclusively on adherence to established standards and procedures. Career advancement systems must provide opportunities for personnel who demonstrate crisis leadership capability and independent effectiveness, rather than promoting only individuals who excel at routine operational tasks within stable institutional environments. Compensation systems must incentivize psychological resilience and professional development, rather than rewarding only short-term operational productivity. But cultural change also requires acknowledging institutional limitations and vulnerabilities that traditional institutional culture has systematically denied or concealed. Personnel must learn to function effectively within institutional systems while maintaining awareness that those systems can fail and that personal and professional survival may require independent action when institutional support proves inadequate. The acknowledgement creates psychological challenges for personnel whose professional identity and personal security depend on institutional reliability. Learning to function effectively within institutions while maintaining psychological independence from those institutions requires sophisticated psychological skills that traditional institutional employment has never required or developed. The recovery process becomes a comprehensive institutional transformation that addresses not just immediate crisis damage, but fundamental structural and cultural problems that made the crisis possible and that could create future vulnerabilities. The transformation requires resources, time, and sustained commitment that may exceed institutional capability, especially during a period when operational effectiveness is already compromised by crisis-related damage. Success requires not just institutional improvement, but institutional evolution into something more resilient and adaptable than the original system. Failure means not just continued vulnerability to future crises, but institutional decline that could culminate in complete operational collapse and political replacement of institutional approaches to regional control with alternative systems that promise greater reliability and effectiveness. The stakes extend beyond immediate institutional survival to encompass the broader imperial system that depends on institutional effectiveness for maintaining regional stability and political control. Institutional failure could create political precedents that encourage challenges to imperial authority throughout the broader imperial territory, creating cascading political problems that extend far beyond local or regional concerns. The machine stands at a crossroads. It must choose between evolution and extinction, between adapting to become something new and more resilient, or continuing on its current trajectory toward inevitable obsolescence and replacement. The choice will determine not just institutional fate, but the fate of everyone whose life and livelihood depend on institutional survival and success. The test of institutional character has begun. Now comes the test of institutional will and wisdom. The uniforms change on a Wednesday morning in November 1857. British red replaces Mughal crimson, but the walls remain indifferent to the color of cloth worn by the men who patrol their perimeters. Stone remembers pressure, not allegiance. The gates that once processed imperial prisoners now process colonial detainees, and the elephant enclosures that once housed instruments of Mughal justice become storage areas for British military equipment that serves similar purposes through different methods. The transition occurs with administrative efficiency that suggests institutional memory transcends political transformation. British colonial administrators inherit detailed operational manuals that document security procedures, prisoner management protocols, and crowd control techniques developed through 3 centuries of imperial experience. The manuals contain institutional knowledge that proves immediately useful for colonial authorities facing similar challenges of regional control and population management. The architectural inheritance proves even more valuable than the documentary records. The fort's designers created spatial relationships that serve colonial security requirements without modification. Surveillance sight lines that enabled Mughal guards to monitor prisoner activities function equally well for British personnel managing colonial detainees. Crowd control barriers that regulated movement during imperial judicial proceedings provide effective management of colonial civil disturbances. Most significantly, the psychological infrastructure remains fully functional, despite political transformation. Local populations who learn to fear imperial authority transfer that fear to colonial authority without requiring new conditioning processes. The stones that witnessed Mughal executions continue to generate appropriate emotional responses when British administrators require public demonstrations of colonial power. The colonial adaptation reveals the universality of institutional violence across political systems and cultural contexts. Different empires employ different justifications and different methods, but the fundamental requirements remain constant: the need to demonstrate state power, the need to process resistance systematically, and the need to maintain psychological control over populations that might otherwise challenge authority through organized resistance. British colonial records document operational modifications that improve institutional effectiveness while maintaining core functional capabilities. Enhanced record-keeping systems provide better tracking of individual cases and statistical analysis of operational outcomes. Improved medical protocols reduce mortality rates among prisoners whose survival serves colonial interests. Modernized communication systems enable faster coordination between the fort and other colonial administrative facilities throughout the region. But the modifications also reveal colonial recognition that institutional reputation provides strategic advantage that extends beyond immediate operational requirements. British administrators understand that effective institutional intimidation reduces the resources required for regional control by preventing resistance activities that would otherwise require expensive military intervention. The fort's reputation for systematic processing of political opposition creates deterrent effects that serve colonial interests throughout the broader territorial administration. The deterrent effectiveness depends on continuity of institutional operation that demonstrates colonial commitment to systematic processing of resistance activities. Interruption of institutional function would suggest colonial weakness and might encourage resistance activities that could escalate into broader challenges to colonial authority. Maintaining institutional capability therefore becomes a political necessity that transcends immediate operational requirements. The 1857 uprising tests colonial institutional management in ways that reveal both strengths and vulnerabilities inherited from previous imperial administration. The fort's defensive architecture proves effective for protecting colonial personnel and resources during siege conditions that isolate the facility from external support networks. Storage systems developed for extended detention operations provide adequate supplies for sustained defense against hostile forces surrounding the facility. But the siege also exposes psychological vulnerabilities that peaceful colonial administration has failed to address. Personnel who function effectively during routine colonial operations struggle with psychological stress created by sustained threat conditions that require constant vigilance and readiness for armed conflict. The transition from administrative detention facility to military fortress requires psychological adaptations that exceed the capability of personnel whose training focused on routine prisoner management rather than combat operations. Colonial military reinforcement provides additional personnel and equipment that restore institutional capability, but the reinforcement also creates cultural conflicts between military personnel, whose training emphasizes combat effectiveness, and institutional personnel, whose expertise focuses on administrative processing of civilian populations. The cultural conflicts create coordination problems that affect operational effectiveness during the critical period when institutional capability is most essential for regional stability. The resolution of siege conditions requires systematic reconstruction of institutional operations that address both physical damage and psychological trauma experienced by personnel during combat conditions. Physical repairs restore operational capability, but psychological recovery requires extended time periods that affect institutional effectiveness long after immediate military threats end. But the siege experience also provides valuable institutional learning about crisis management and resilience enhancement that improves future operational capability. Personnel who survive combat conditions develop psychological resilience that enhances their effectiveness during routine operations that seem manageable compared to combat stress. Operational procedures modified during siege conditions prove useful for normal operations because they provide enhanced security and improved efficiency. Most importantly, institutional reputation enhanced by successful defense against organized resistance creates deterrent effects that reduce future challenges to colonial authority throughout the region. Local populations who witnessed institutional capability during combat conditions develop increased respect for colonial power that reduces resistance activities and improves compliance with colonial administrative requirements. The post-uprising reconstruction establishes operational patterns that persist through the remainder of colonial administration. Enhanced security procedures become routine rather than emergency measures. Improved personnel training includes combat readiness preparation that enhances individual psychological resilience and operational versatility. Strengthened supply systems provide reserves that ensure institutional capability during future emergency conditions. The reconstruction also establishes institutional culture that combines administrative efficiency with military readiness in ways that prove effective for colonial requirements throughout the imperial period. Personnel develop professional identities that integrate civilian administrative skills with military capabilities, creating institutional competency that serves colonial interests across a broad range of operational requirements. But colonial institutional culture also develops characteristics that distinguish it from previous imperial administration in ways that affect institutional effectiveness and personnel psychology. British emphasis on documentation and statistical analysis creates administrative overhead that sometimes interferes with operational flexibility. Colonial racial hierarchies create personnel conflicts that affect coordination and morale among staff from different ethnic backgrounds. Most significantly, colonial institutional culture develops moral contradictions that create psychological stress for personnel who must reconcile humanitarian rhetoric of colonial civilization with operational reality of systematic violence required for maintaining colonial control. The contradictions create cognitive dissonance that affects personnel effectiveness and contributes to turnover problems that require continuous recruitment and training of replacement personnel. The gradual transformation of institutional function during the late colonial period reflects broader changes in imperial strategy and regional political conditions that affect institutional relevance and resource allocation. Reduced emphasis on direct political repression creates decreased demand for detention and execution capabilities that were central to earlier institutional operations. Increased focus on economic extraction and administrative efficiency creates demand for different institutional capabilities that emphasize bureaucratic processing rather than physical intimidation. The functional transformation occurs gradually through budget modifications and personnel reassignments that redirect institutional resources toward activities that serve evolving colonial priorities. Detention facilities are converted to storage areas for administrative records and commercial goods. Execution equipment is transferred to other facilities or retired as outdated technology that no longer serves contemporary requirements. But the architectural infrastructure remains unchanged because modification costs exceed available budgets and because existing facilities continue to serve useful functions despite changing operational requirements. The walls that once contained imperial prisoners provide adequate security for colonial administrative facilities. The gates that once processed execution audiences provide effective control for commercial and administrative traffic. The persistence of architectural infrastructure ensures that institutional memory remains embedded in physical environment even as operational functions evolve to serve different political purposes. Personnel who work within unchanged physical spaces develop psychological connection to institutional history that affects their professional identity and operational effectiveness in ways that transcend immediate administrative requirements. The independence transition in 1947 creates another uniform change without corresponding architectural modification. Indian national colors replace British colonial insignia, but the same walls continue to define spatial relationships that serve state security requirements regardless of political ideology or cultural identity. The institutional infrastructure proves equally useful for independent national administration as it had for imperial and colonial governance. Post-independence operational requirements include detention of political prisoners whose resistance activities threaten national stability, processing of refugees whose displacement creates administrative challenges, and management of civil disturbances that require coordinated state response. These requirements prove remarkably similar to those that justified institutional construction 4 centuries earlier, suggesting fundamental continuities in state power requirements that transcend political transformation. Independent administrators inherit operational expertise and institutional knowledge that enables immediate utilization of facility capabilities without extended transition periods that might create security vulnerabilities during political transformation. British colonial documentation provides detailed guidance for institutional operations that proves immediately useful for independent administrators facing similar challenges with different political justifications. But independent administration also creates opportunities for operational modifications that reflect national priorities and cultural values different from previous imperial and colonial approaches. Enhanced attention to prisoner welfare reflects humanitarian concerns that affect detention conditions and procedural requirements. Increased emphasis on legal procedures affects processing timelines and documentation requirements that influence institutional efficiency. Most significantly, independent administration must address institutional reputation inherited from imperial and colonial periods that creates legitimacy problems for national authorities seeking to distinguish their governance from previous foreign control. The institutional association with imperial oppression creates political complications for national leaders who must justify continued operation of facilities that symbolize foreign domination of Indian populations. The legitimacy challenges force institutional modifications that address symbolic concerns while maintaining operational capability required for national security purposes. Architectural modifications include symbolic changes that demonstrate national control and cultural identity. Operational procedures are modified to emphasize legal protections and humanitarian standards that distinguish national administration from imperial and colonial precedents. But the modifications also reveal the practical constraints that limit institutional transformation, regardless of political intentions or cultural priorities. Security requirements that justified original construction continue to influence operational procedures because alternative approaches prove inadequate for maintaining state control during political instability. Architectural features that served imperial purposes continue to provide useful capabilities for national administration facing similar challenges with limited resources for comprehensive facility reconstruction. The gradual evolution toward tourist destination begins during the 1960s as government authorities recognize economic opportunities created by historical significance and architectural distinction of heritage sites that attract domestic and international visitors. Tourism provides revenue that helps justify maintenance costs for facilities whose operational security requirements have declined due to political stability and alternative security infrastructure. Tourist development requires operational modifications that balance historical preservation with visitor safety and commercial viability. Security procedures are modified to accommodate civilian access while maintaining protection for architectural features and sensitive historical artifacts. Commercial facilities are developed to provide visitor services while minimizing impact on historical integrity and architectural authenticity. But tourist development also requires careful management of historical interpretation that acknowledges institutional history while avoiding content that might disturb visitors or create political complications for contemporary administration. Historical documentation includes extensive evidence of systematic violence and human rights violations that creates interpretive challenges for tourism authorities seeking to attract visitors without providing disturbing content that might affect visitor experience or international reputation. The interpretive solution emphasizes architectural achievement and historical significance while minimizing discussion of operational details that documented systematic human rights violations. Tourist materials focus on construction techniques, artistic features, and political importance while avoiding specific descriptions of detention conditions, execution procedures, and institutional violence that characterize daily operations throughout most of institutional history. The selective interpretation creates sanitized historical narrative that preserves tourism appeal while concealing institutional reality that might provide educational value for contemporary audiences seeking to understand historical development of state violence and institutional oppression. The sanitization serves commercial interests but compromises historical accuracy in ways that affect public understanding of institutional history and its contemporary relevance. Modern visitor experience reflects successful transformation of institutional infrastructure from functional facility for state violence into commercial attraction that generates revenue while providing historical education through carefully controlled interpretation. Tourists move through the same spaces that once contained imperial prisoners, but their experience has managed to emphasize aesthetic appreciation and historical curiosity rather than emotional response to evidence of systematic human suffering. The spatial choreography that once controlled prisoner movement now controls tourist flow through predetermined routes that optimize visitor experience while protecting architectural features and managing crowd density. The same psychological principles that made institutional space effective for intimidation and control now serve tourism purposes by creating impressive visitor experiences that encourage positive reviews and repeat visits. Audio guides provide historical information through carefully scripted narratives that emphasize architectural achievement and political significance while avoiding detailed discussion of operational procedures that might disturb visitor enjoyment. The scripts acknowledge historical violence through euphemistic language that suggests institutional severity without providing specific descriptions that might create emotional distress or political controversy. But sophisticated visitors recognize architectural evidence that reveals institutional reality despite interpretive sanitization. Sightlines that enabled surveillance continue to demonstrate panopticon principles that served institutional control. Drainage systems that handled biological waste continue to evidence systematic processing of human bodies. Acoustic properties that amplified certain sounds while muffling others continue to demonstrate psychological manipulation techniques that served institutional intimidation. The architectural evidence provides educational opportunities for visitors whose historical knowledge enables recognition of institutional reality despite interpretive limitations imposed by commercial and political considerations. These visitors can understand institutional history through physical evidence that transcends official interpretation while respecting institutional transformation into heritage site that serves contemporary cultural and economic purposes. The guided tours reveal institutional knowledge preserved in administrative memory, despite political transformation and functional evolution that changed operational purposes while maintaining architectural infrastructure. Guides whose families include multiple generations of institutional employment possess informal knowledge about operational procedures, personnel culture, and institutional history that supplements official documentation and interpretive materials. The informal knowledge includes stories about specific individuals, particular incidents, and operational details that humanize institutional history while providing context for understanding architectural features and spatial relationships. The stories suggest institutional reality that official interpretation avoids while providing emotional connection that enhances visitor experience and educational value. But the informal knowledge also reveals institutional trauma preserved in community memory despite official efforts to minimize discussion of historical violence and human rights violations. Families whose ancestors experienced institutional violence maintain oral histories that contradict sanitized official interpretation while providing authentic perspective on institutional impact that affected regional populations throughout operational history. The trauma preservation creates tension between tourism development that requires positive visitor experience and historical accuracy that demands acknowledgement of systematic violence and human suffering. The tension affects interpretive decisions and guide training that must balance commercial viability with educational responsibility and historical integrity. Contemporary political context affects visitor interpretation and emotional response to institutional history in ways that reflect current events and contemporary concerns about state violence and human rights. Visitors whose personal experience includes political oppression or state violence respond to institutional history with emotional intensity that transcends historical curiosity and aesthetic appreciation. The contemporary relevance creates educational opportunities for understanding institutional development and operational principles that continue to affect modern governance and social control. The fort provides historical example of systematic state violence that illuminates contemporary debates about security policy, detention procedures, and human rights protections. But contemporary relevance also creates interpretive challenges for tourism authorities who must manage visitor experience that includes emotional responses to evidence of state violence that remains politically sensitive despite historical distance. International visitors may interpret institutional history through contemporary political frameworks that create diplomatic complications for authorities seeking to maintain positive international relationships. The tourist transformation represents successful adaptive reuse of institutional infrastructure that preserves historical significance while serving contemporary economic and cultural purposes. The transformation demonstrates institutional resilience and adaptability that enables survival and relevance, despite fundamental changes in political context and operational requirements. But the transformation also represents historical sanitization that conceals institutional reality in ways that limit educational value and public understanding of state violence and institutional oppression. The sanitization serves commercial and political interests while compromising historical accuracy and contemporary relevance that might provide valuable insights for understanding modern governance and social control. The walls remain. The gates continue to frame human movement. The sight lines still enable surveillance. The acoustic properties still shape communication. The spatial relationships still influence psychological response. The architectural infrastructure continues to function despite political transformation and interpretive sanitization that changes official meaning while preserving operational capability. The stones remember pressure, temperature, moisture, and time. They remember the weight of feet that walked these corridors, the heat of bodies that occupied these spaces, the moisture of human suffering that soaked into their surfaces, and the time that passed while humans created institutional memory through systematic violence and administrative efficiency. The institutional memory persists in architecture that transcends political transformation and interpretive modification. The physical evidence continues to testify to institutional reality despite official efforts to minimize discussion of operational procedures and human impact. The spaces continue to generate psychological responses that reflect architectural design intended to influence human behavior and emotional state. But institutional memory also persists in community knowledge and family stories that preserve understanding of institutional reality despite political pressure to minimize discussion of historical violence and human rights violations. The community memory provides alternative interpretation that supplements and sometimes contradicts official tourism narratives while preserving authentic perspective on institutional impact. The question becomes whether contemporary society can learn from institutional history that demonstrates systematic development of state violence and administrative oppression, or whether commercial and political interests will continue to sanitize historical interpretation in ways that limit educational value and public understanding of institutional legacy that continues to affect modern governance and social control. The wall that thinks has become the wall that remembers selectively, emphasizing architectural achievement while minimizing discussion of human suffering. The selective memory serves contemporary interests while concealing historical lessons that might provide valuable insights for understanding and preventing institutional violence in contemporary contexts. The machine has learned to survive by forgetting selectively and remembering strategically. Now the question becomes whether human visitors can learn to read architectural evidence that transcends official interpretation while respecting institutional transformation into heritage site that serves contemporary purposes. The stones wait patiently for visitors who possess sufficient knowledge and emotional courage to understand institutional reality despite interpretive sanitization. They continue to testify to systematic human suffering and administrative efficiency that created institutional legacy persisting in architectural form that transcends political transformation and commercial adaptation. The verdict remains unwritten, waiting for each visitor to decide whether they will accept sanitized interpretation or engage with architectural evidence that reveals institutional reality, despite official efforts to minimize discussion of systematic violence and human rights violations that characterize daily operations throughout most of institutional history. A wall that can hold an empire can also hold a conscience. The question is, whose conscience will it hold, and what will they choose to remember? The morning fog rises from the Yamuna at precisely 6:47, just as it did 500 years ago when the first stones were set in place. But now the mist carries different sounds, the rumble of tour buses replacing the shuffle of chained prisoners, the chatter of guides replacing the commands of executioners, the click of cameras replacing the scrape of cleaning tools that once removed evidence of what occurred in these spaces. The transformation metrics tell their own story. Annual visitor count: 1.7 million people moving through spaces that once processed perhaps a few hundred prisoners per year during peak operational periods. Revenue generation: 43 million rupees annually from ticket sales, guided tours, and commercial activities within spaces that once generated costs measured in human suffering rather than economic benefit. Employment figures: 237 people now earning livelihoods from heritage preservation and tourism management in facilities that once employed similar numbers for detention and execution operations. But the numbers cannot measure what has been lost in translation from functional institution to heritage attraction. The sanitization process required systematic removal of physical evidence that might disturb tourist experience or create interpretive complications for contemporary administration. Original interrogation chambers have been converted to storage areas that visitors never see. Execution equipment has been removed or relocated to museum contexts where it appears as historical artifact rather than functional technology. Drainage systems that handled biological waste have been modified for modern plumbing that serves visitor facilities and maintenance requirements. The architectural modifications serve practical purposes but also erase evidence that might provide authentic historical education about institutional reality and human cost of state violence. Visitors experience spatial relationships and visual aesthetics without understanding functional purposes that gave these spaces their historical significance and contemporary relevance. The experience becomes appreciation of architectural achievement rather than education about institutional development and operational principles that continue to affect modern governance. The Guide Training Manual, a document that would be familiar to administrators who once trained personnel for very different purposes, specifies approved content and prohibited topics with administrative precision that echoes institutional operational procedures. Approved topics include architectural history, artistic significance, and political importance expressed through euphemistic language that acknowledges historical violence without providing disturbing details. Prohibited topics include specific execution methods, detailed descriptions of detention conditions, and discussion of contemporary relevance that might create political controversy or emotional distress. The manual's language reveals institutional memory preserved in administrative culture despite functional transformation. Operational efficiency remains prioritized over individual comfort or emotional authenticity. Systematic procedures continue to govern personnel behavior and visitor interaction despite changed purpose and different objectives. Most significantly, institutional authority continues to control information flow and public interpretation despite democratic political context and commercial rather than coercive operational framework. The guide performance demonstrates professional skills developed through training that emphasizes crowd management, information control, and emotional manipulation techniques that serve tourism purposes while concealing institutional reality. Guides learn to read audience reactions and adjust their presentations to maintain positive visitor experience while avoiding topics that might create disturbance or controversy. They develop sensitivity to individual visitor responses and group dynamics that enables effective management of diverse audiences with varying cultural backgrounds and emotional preparedness. But guide training also includes informal education about institutional history that contradicts official interpretation while providing context that enhances professional effectiveness. Experienced guides whose families include institutional employees from previous eras possess knowledge about operational procedures, personnel culture, and historical incidents that supplements official documentation while providing authentic perspective on institutional development and community impact. The informal knowledge creates tension between official tourism policy that requires sanitized interpretation and professional effectiveness that benefits from authentic historical understanding. Guides must navigate between administrative requirements and visitor expectations while managing personal knowledge that includes disturbing content about systematic violence and human rights violations that official policy seeks to minimize. The visitor demographic analysis reveals audience composition that affects interpretive requirements and emotional management challenges. Domestic visitors include significant percentages of individuals whose family histories include direct or indirect experience of institutional violence, colonial oppression, and political persecution that creates personal connection to institutional history, transcending tourist curiosity. International visitors include individuals from cultural backgrounds that emphasize human rights concerns and historical accountability in ways that create expectations for authentic historical interpretation, despite tourism policy that prioritizes positive visitor experience. Educational group visits present particular challenges because academic contexts require historical accuracy and critical analysis that conflicts with tourism interpretation designed to minimize discussion of systematic violence and institutional oppression. Teacher preparation and student educational objectives often include emphasis on understanding historical development of state violence and institutional control that exceeds tourism interpretation designed for general audiences seeking recreational rather than educational experience. The interpretive balance requires sophisticated management of different audience expectations and educational requirements within single facility that serves multiple purposes through unified operational framework. Tourism authorities must accommodate educational visitors whose requirements include authentic historical interpretation while maintaining positive experience for recreational visitors whose expectations focus on aesthetic appreciation and cultural entertainment rather than critical historical analysis. The seasonal variation in visitor composition creates additional interpretive challenges as tourist demographics change throughout the year in ways that affect audience expectations and emotional preparedness for historical content. Summer vacation periods bring family groups that include children whose educational needs differ from adult visitors and whose emotional capacity requires modified presentation of historical content that acknowledges institutional reality without providing traumatic exposure to evidence of systematic violence. Winter tourism includes higher percentages of serious historical tourists and international visitors whose cultural backgrounds and educational expectations require more sophisticated historical interpretation despite official policy that emphasizes architectural achievement over operational reality. These visitors often possess background knowledge about institutional history that enables recognition of interpretive sanitization while creating expectations for authentic historical education that exceeds approved tourism content. The commercial pressure affects interpretive decisions in ways that prioritize visitor satisfaction and repeat business over historical accuracy and educational value. Positive visitor reviews require maintenance of tourism experience that emphasizes impressive architecture and fascinating history while avoiding content that might create emotional disturbance or political controversy. Negative reviews that mention disturbing historical content affect tourism revenues and political support for heritage preservation programs that depend on commercial viability for continued operation. But commercial success also depends on visitor experience that provides sufficient historical authenticity to justify travel expense and time investment required for heritage tourism. Visitors who detect excessive sanitization or obvious historical omissions may develop negative responses that affect reviews and recommendations despite positive aesthetic experience. Tourism authorities must balance historical authenticity with visitor comfort in ways that satisfy diverse audience expectations while maintaining political and commercial viability. The international tourism context creates additional pressure for interpretive approaches that acknowledge historical violence and human rights violations in ways that demonstrate contemporary Indian commitment to democratic values and human rights protections. International visitors whose cultural backgrounds emphasize historical accountability and institutional transparency expect heritage interpretation that demonstrates learning from historical experience rather than concealment of historical reality. But international tourism also creates sensitivity about historical interpretation that might reinforce negative stereotypes about Indian culture or governance that affect diplomatic relationships and economic development. Tourism authorities must manage historical interpretation that acknowledges institutional violence, while emphasizing positive aspects of contemporary Indian democracy and cultural achievement that counteract negative historical associations. The educational outreach programs reveal institutional memory preserved in academic and cultural contexts despite tourism sanitization that limits public historical interpretation. University research programs and scholarly publications provide detailed documentation of institutional history that supplements tourism interpretation while maintaining academic standards for historical accuracy and critical analysis. Cultural preservation organizations maintain oral history projects that document community memory and family stories that provide authentic perspective on institutional impact, despite official efforts to minimize discussion of systematic violence. But educational outreach also reveals generational differences in historical memory and institutional understanding that affect contemporary relevance and public engagement with institutional history. Older generations whose personal experience includes colonial period and independence struggle maintain detailed knowledge about institutional operations and community impact that younger generations lack due to educational systems that emphasize contemporary issues over detailed historical analysis of institutional development and state violence. The generational knowledge gap creates challenges for heritage preservation programs that depend on community engagement and public support for continued operation and funding. Without community understanding of institutional historical significance and contemporary relevance, heritage sites risk becoming merely commercial attractions that generate tourism revenue without providing educational value or cultural preservation that justifies public resource allocation. The technology integration in modern tourism experience reveals opportunities for enhanced historical interpretation that could address limitations of live guide presentations while providing educational content that serves diverse audience needs and cultural backgrounds. Audio guide systems enable multilingual interpretation that accommodates international visitors while providing detailed historical content that exceeds live guide presentation constraints. Interactive displays could provide optional access to detailed historical documentation that satisfies serious historical tourists while maintaining sanitized general interpretation for recreational visitors. Virtual reality applications could enable immersive historical experience that demonstrates institutional operations without requiring physical modification of heritage architecture or exposure to disturbing content for unprepared visitors. Augmented reality systems could provide layered interpretation that enables visitors to access different levels of historical detail according to their educational interests and emotional preparedness, while maintaining unified tourism experience within shared physical environment. But technology integration also creates challenges for heritage preservation that prioritizes architectural integrity and authentic historical atmosphere over contemporary commercial enhancements that might compromise visitor experience of genuine historical environment. Technology installations require infrastructure modification that affects architectural authenticity while creating maintenance requirements that strain heritage preservation budgets and operational capabilities. The documentation preservation reveals institutional memory maintained in archival collections that provide comprehensive record of institutional development and operational procedures despite tourism interpretation that minimizes discussion of systematic violence and human rights violations. Government archives, university collections, and private family records contain extensive documentation of detention procedures, execution methods, and personnel culture that could provide authentic historical education despite political sensitivity and commercial concerns. But archival access remains limited due to classification restrictions, family privacy concerns, and institutional sensitivity about historical documentation that contradicts contemporary political narratives and tourism interpretation. Researchers and educators often encounter bureaucratic obstacles that limit access to historical materials, while tourism authorities maintain interpretation that lacks authentic historical foundation despite extensive documentary evidence available in restricted archival collections. The preservation challenges extend beyond individual archives to encompass community knowledge and family stories that provide authentic perspective on institutional impact and historical development. Oral history preservation requires systematic collection and documentation of community memory before generational knowledge transfer ends due to natural aging and urban development that disperses traditional communities whose knowledge includes institutional memory. Community engagement programs could provide opportunities for authentic historical interpretation that incorporates local knowledge and family stories while respecting privacy concerns and cultural sensitivities that affect public discussion of historical violence and trauma. Community participation in heritage interpretation could enhance tourism experience while providing economic opportunities for local populations whose knowledge includes institutional memory that supplements official historical documentation. The conservation science reveals architectural evidence preserved in physical structures, despite functional modifications, and interpretive sanitization that limit public historical understanding. Forensic analysis of building materials, construction techniques, and architectural modifications provides objective evidence of institutional operations and historical development that transcends political interpretation and commercial constraints. Archaeological investigation of foundation layers, drainage systems, and architectural features reveals evidence of systematic institutional operations, despite official emphasis on architectural achievement over operational reality. Building pathology studies document environmental impact and structural deterioration that reflects institutional history while providing scientific foundation for conservation planning that could preserve architectural evidence for future historical research and educational programs. Chemical analysis of building materials reveals evidence of institutional operations that could provide authentic historical interpretation despite political sensitivity and commercial concerns about disturbing content. But conservation science also reveals the urgent need for preservation intervention that requires significant resource allocation and technical expertise that exceeds current heritage preservation budgets and administrative capabilities. Without immediate conservation action, architectural evidence and physical historical materials face deterioration that could eliminate authentic historical documentation despite growing recognition of institutional significance and contemporary educational value. The global heritage context positions Agra Fort within international framework of historical preservation and cultural understanding that emphasizes educational value and authentic historical interpretation over commercial tourism and political sanitization. UNESCO World Heritage designation creates international expectations for historical preservation and authentic interpretation that could support enhanced educational programs despite domestic political sensitivity about institutional history and systematic violence. International heritage preservation organizations provide technical expertise and financial resources that could enable authentic historical interpretation and educational programs that serve international tourism while maintaining cultural integrity and historical accuracy. Global academic networks offer collaborative research opportunities that could enhance understanding of institutional development and operational principles, while providing educational resources that serve contemporary needs for understanding state violence and institutional control. But international heritage designation also creates pressure for tourism development and commercial viability that may conflict with authentic historical interpretation and educational programming that acknowledges systematic violence and human rights violations. International visitors and heritage organizations may have conflicting expectations about historical interpretation that emphasizes architectural achievement versus institutional reality and contemporary relevance. The conclusion emerges slowly, like morning fog lifting to reveal landscape that was always present but previously obscured. The fort represents successful institutional adaptation that demonstrates how power structures persist through political transformation, cultural change, and functional evolution while maintaining essential operational characteristics that serve state interests regardless of ideology or administrative framework. The architectural persistence enables physical evidence of institutional development to survive despite political efforts to modify historical interpretation and commercial pressure to sanitize heritage presentation for tourism consumption. The stones continue to testify to systematic human suffering and administrative efficiency that created institutional legacy persisting in contemporary governance and social control despite democratic political context and human rights rhetoric. But the fort also represents missed educational opportunities and cultural amnesia that limits contemporary understanding of institutional development and state violence that continue to affect modern governance and social relationships. The sanitization serves commercial and political interests while compromising historical accuracy and contemporary relevance that could provide valuable insights for understanding and preventing institutional violence and systematic oppression. The ultimate question becomes whether contemporary society possesses sufficient historical knowledge and moral courage to learn from institutional evidence that demonstrates systematic development of state violence and administrative control, or whether commercial and political interests will continue to prioritize sanitized heritage interpretation over authentic historical education that acknowledges human cost and contemporary relevance of institutional violence. The walls wait for visitors who can read architectural evidence and understand institutional reality despite interpretive limitations imposed by tourism and political considerations. They continue to offer educational opportunities for understanding institutional development and operational principles that transcend historical context while maintaining contemporary relevance for democratic governance and human rights protection. The machine has learned to hide in plain sight, disguised as heritage attraction that generates tourism revenue while concealing institutional knowledge that could provide valuable education about state violence and systematic oppression. The disguise serves contemporary interests while preserving architectural evidence that waits for future recognition and understanding that could transform sanitized heritage site into authentic educational resource. The verdict remains unwritten, carved into stones that remember everything while authorities remember selectively. Each visitor must choose between accepting sanitized interpretation designed for commercial and political comfort or engaging with architectural evidence that reveals institutional reality, despite official efforts to minimize discussion of systematic violence that characterized daily operations throughout institutional history. The wall that thinks has become the wall that whispers, speaking softly to visitors who possess knowledge and courage sufficient to understand institutional reality, despite interpretive sanitization designed to protect contemporary sensibilities from historical truth about state violence and human suffering. The conscience remains embedded in stone, waiting for recognition from visitors who can distinguish between heritage tourism that celebrates architectural achievement and historical education that acknowledges human cost of institutional development. The choice belongs to each individual who enters these gates and decides what they will allow themselves to understand about power, violence, and the persistent legacy of systematic oppression disguised as tourist attraction. In the end, beautiful security reveals its most successful disguise: the transformation of operational facility into heritage destination that preserves institutional architecture while concealing institutional memory, maintaining physical evidence while sanitizing historical interpretation, serving contemporary interests while abandoning historical truth to political convenience and commercial viability. The wall that can hold an empire has learned to hold a conscience selectively, preserving what serves contemporary purposes while concealing what might provide authentic historical education. The question remains whether future visitors will possess sufficient knowledge and courage to read architectural evidence that transcends sanitized interpretation while respecting institutional transformation into heritage site that serves contemporary cultural and economic purposes. The stones remember everything. The question is whether anyone remembers how to listen